Welcome to Sheriff Files. Please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from tonight. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. You hear it around 2 a.m. Scratching, slow. Always closer than the night before. That's what Mrs. Henley told me on that Tuesday morning in October, standing in my office with her house slippers still on, and her gray hair pinned back like she'd dressed in a hurry. She clutched her purse against her chest like it might protect her from whatever had been keeping her awake for the past 3 weeks. I'd been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years. In a town of 800 souls, you learn to read people's faces like weather patterns. Mrs. Henley's face told me she hadn't slept properly in a month. Dark crescents hung beneath her eyes, and her hands trembled just enough to make me set down my coffee and really listen. "It started under the kitchen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right where I keep the good china cabinet. Sounds like fingernails on wood, but longer. Slower. Like whatever's making it has all the time in the world." I'd heard stranger things in my years wearing this badge, but something about the way she said it made the hair on my forearms stand up. Millbrook sits in a valley between 2 ridges of limestone, the kind of geography that holds sound in peculiar ways. On still nights, you can hear a whisper from 3 blocks away, but sometimes a gunshot gets swallowed up like it never happened at all. "Any idea what might be causing it?" I asked, though I suspected she'd already ruled out the obvious culprits. "Checked for mice, rats, even called Pete Morrison to look for groundhogs or possums. Nothing." She shook her head. "Pete said the strangest thing, though. Said the dirt under my house smells wrong. Sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase." I made a note to talk to Pete. He'd been doing pest control in Millbrook since before I pinned on my badge, and if he said something smelled wrong, it was worth investigating. That afternoon, I drove out to the Henley place on Sycamore Street. It's one of those 2-story houses built in the 1920s, when folks still believed in front porches and storm cellars. The kind of house that settles into the ground over decades, becoming part of the landscape rather than something imposed upon it. Mrs. Henley was waiting for me on the porch, wringing her hands. "It's quiet during the day," she said. "Always quiet when the sun's up. But come nightfall." I walked around the perimeter of the house, looking for obvious signs of animal activity. No burrows, no disturbed dirt, no tracks in the soft soil around the foundation. The basement windows were intact, the foundation solid. But there was something else, a smell, faint but persistent. Sweet, like Mrs. Henley had mentioned, but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. Something organic and patient. "Mind if I take a look underneath?" I asked. The crawl space entrance was around back, a small wooden door set into the foundation like the mouth of a root cellar. Mrs. Henley hesitated before handing me her flashlight. "I haven't been under there in 20 years, she said. "Not since Harold passed. He always handled that sort of thing." I knelt and opened the small door. The smell hit me immediately, that sweet, cloying scent, but stronger now. The beam of my flashlight revealed a typical crawl space, dirt floor, wooden joists, the occasional spider web. But the dirt looked disturbed. Not like something had been digging, exactly, but like it had been carefully smoothed over, as if someone had taken time to cover their tracks. I crawled in far enough to examine the area directly under the kitchen. The floorboards above showed no signs of damage, but the dirt below had been shaped into subtle ridges and valleys, like the surface of a calm lake after something large had moved through it and settled to the bottom. That was when I noticed the silence. In 37 years of law enforcement, you develop an ear for the sounds a place should make. A crawl space should have insects, settling wood, maybe the scurry of a mouse. This space held the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, the kind that makes you realize sound itself can be a comfort. I backed out and stood, brushing dirt from my knees. "Find anything?" Mrs. Henley asked. "Nothing obvious," I said, which was true. "I'll check back tonight, see if I can hear what you're talking about." That evening, I parked across the street from the Henley house and settled in to wait. Millbrook after dark is a different creature entirely. The streetlights cast pools of yellow that seem to make the shadows deeper rather than pushing them back. Most folks are inside by 9 o'clock, leaving the streets to the sounds that belong to small towns, the hum of electrical lines, the distant call of a train horn, the rustle of wind through the old oaks that line every street. Around 11:30, I saw Mrs. Henley's bedroom light go out. The house settled into darkness, and I waited. At 1:47 a.m. I heard it. The sound was exactly as she'd described, a slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails drawn across wood with careful precision. But there was something else, something she hadn't mentioned. Between the scratches and the brief pauses, I could swear I heard breathing. Not the quick panting of an animal, but the deep, measured breaths of something much larger. I got out of my patrol car and approached the house. The scratching continued, and I was able to determine it was indeed coming from beneath the kitchen. I walked around to the crawl space entrance and knelt beside it, putting my ear close to the small door. The sound stopped immediately. I waited 10 minutes, but the scratching didn't resume. When I checked with Mrs. Henley the next morning, she confirmed that it had continued until just before dawn. "It knows when someone's listening," she said. "That's what frightens me most." Over the next few days, 3 more residents came forward with similar complaints. Tom Bradford, who lived on Elm Street, reported scratching sounds under his living room that had been going on for 2 weeks. Sarah Chin, whose house sat on the corner of Main and Prospect, described the same slow, deliberate sound coming from beneath her dining room. Most unsettling was old Ray Milhouse, whose family had been in Millbrook since before it was incorporated. Ray was past 80 and sharp as a tack, not the type to imagine things or seek attention. "My grandfather used to tell stories," Ray said when he came to see me. "Said there were things that lived in the ground before this town was built. Things that didn't take kindly to having houses put on top of them." I asked him what kind of things. "The kind that waited," Ray said. "The kind that were patient enough to let a whole town settle in before deciding what to do about it." I didn't put much stock in old stories, but I couldn't ignore the pattern that was emerging. All 4 houses were built in the 1920s. All 4 sat on the original part of town, what used to be called the Lower District before the residential expansion in the 50s. And all 4 were experiencing the same phenomenon, slow scratching sounds that began around 2 a.m. and continued until dawn, always stopping when someone tried to investigate. I decided to consult the town records, looking for any mention of unusual events or discoveries during the original construction period. What I found in the basement of the town hall made me wish I'd left well enough alone. The records from 1923 contained a brief report from the construction foreman, a man named William Cross. He documented several delays in the foundation work, all attributed to difficult soil conditions. But buried in his notes was a single line that made my blood run cold. "Workers report tools going missing overnight. Found buried in perfect rows 6 feet down. Recommend completion of project be expedited." There were other mentions scattered through the records. A report of 3 construction workers quitting without notice after claiming they heard voices coming from the excavated basements. A note from the town doctor about an unusual number of residents complaining of insomnia and nervous conditions in the months following completion of the lower district. Most disturbing was a letter from Father McKenna, who'd served at St. Mary's from 1920 to 1930. He'd written to the bishop requesting permission to perform a blessing over the new residential area, claiming that the ground itself seems afflicted with a restless spirit that disturbs the peace of Christian families. The bishop's response was filed with the letter. Request denied. Father McKenna is to confine his ministrations to matters of clear spiritual import, and avoid encouraging superstition among the faithful. I spent that evening at the library, researching the area's history before European settlement. The local Native American tribes, primarily the Seneca, had considered the valley sacred but had never established permanent settlements there. According to the few historical accounts I could find, they believed the ground was home to what they called the sleepers, entities that dwelled beneath the earth and were best left undisturbed. The more I learned, the less I wanted to know. But I was the sheriff, and 4 families were losing sleep over something that was either supernatural or the work of someone with a very sick sense of humor. Either way, it was my job to get to the bottom of it. I decided to spend a full night under one of the affected houses, recording whatever I found. Mrs. Henley was reluctant to give permission, but her exhaustion finally overcame her fear. I waited until midnight before crawling into the space beneath her kitchen, armed with a digital recorder, a camera, and enough batteries to last until dawn. The sweet smell was stronger than before, almost overwhelming in the confined space. I positioned myself directly under where the scratching typically occurred and settled in to wait. At 2:03 a.m. it began. The scratching was louder from underneath, but it wasn't coming from above as I'd expected. It was coming from below, from somewhere deeper in the earth beneath the house. As I listened, I realized that what I was hearing wasn't fingernails on wood at all. It was the sound of something moving through soil, something large enough to displace significant amounts of earth with each movement. I activated my recorder and tried to control my breathing. The sound continued for nearly an hour, following a pattern I hadn't noticed from outside the house. 3 long scratches, followed by a pause, then 2 short ones. Over and over, with mechanical precision. At 3:15 a.m., the pattern changed. The scratching stopped, replaced by a different sound, a low humming that seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't quite musical, but there was a rhythm to it, like a lullaby played at the wrong speed. As I listened, I became aware of vibration in the ground beneath me, as if something massive was moving far below. That was when I saw the dirt begin to shift. Not dramatically, just a subtle settling, as if the earth were rearranging itself around something that was no longer there. I watched, transfixed, as small depressions appeared in the soil, forming a pattern I couldn't quite make sense of in the darkness. I reached for my flashlight, but as soon as the beam illuminated the ground, everything stopped. The humming ceased, the vibrations ended, and the air became still enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. I waited in silence for 20 minutes before the scratching resumed, but now it sounded different, angrier, more urgent. And it was definitely closer to the surface than before. I stayed until dawn, documenting everything I could. When I finally emerged from the crawl space, I was covered in that sweet-smelling dirt, and my hands were shaking badly enough that I had trouble starting my patrol car. The recording I'd made was mostly static, but there were sections where you could clearly hear the scratching and humming I'd experienced. More disturbing were the photographs I'd taken. In several images, the beam of my flashlight had caught what looked like handprints in the dirt, but they were too large to be human, and they had too many fingers. I drove straight to Pete Morrison's house and found him having coffee on his back porch. "Pete," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. When you were under Mrs. Henley's house, what exactly did you see?" Pete set down his coffee cup carefully, the way people do when they're about to say something they don't want to say. "You're going to think I've lost my mind," he said. "Try me." The dirt under there, it's been moved. Recently. But not by any animal I know. The patterns are too regular, too purposeful. And there are spaces, hollow areas, like something's been excavating from underneath. He paused, staring into his coffee. There's something else. I found marks in the soil. Prints, but not from anything that walks on the surface. They're wrong, Sheriff. Like someone took a human hand and added parts that don't belong. I showed Pete the photographs I'd taken. His face went white. That's them, he said. But these are fresh. Yesterday, those prints weren't there. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to process what we were dealing with. Pete, I said finally, how long have you lived in Millbrook? 43 years come November. Ever heard any stories about the lower district? Anything unusual about the ground there? Pete nodded slowly. My daddy used to do construction work back in the day. He helped build some of those houses in the 20s. Said the ground fought them every step of the way. Tools would disappear, foundations would crack overnight, and the workers started having dreams. What kind of dreams? About being underground. About being buried alive, but not being dead. About waiting in the dark for something to come and dig them up. That afternoon, I made a decision that probably violated several procedures and definitely ignored common sense. I contacted a professor at the State University who specialized in local folklore, and arranged to meet him that evening. Dr. Marcus Webb was a thin man in his 50s with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors with books. He listened to my account without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Sheriff, he said finally, what you're describing matches accounts I've documented in 3 other locations across the region. All of them are geological depressions where indigenous peoples avoided permanent settlement. All of them have limestone substrates with extensive cave systems. He opened his journal and showed me a map marked with red dots. The pattern suggests these sites were chosen for a specific reason. The limestone is particularly good at conducting sound and vibration. If something were living deep underground, these locations would provide optimal conditions for communication. Communication with what? That's the question, isn't it? Dr. Webb closed his journal. The native accounts I've studied suggest these entities, whatever they are, have been dormant for centuries. But construction, particularly the kind of deep excavation required for foundations, may have disturbed that dormancy. He looked at me seriously. Sheriff, I don't think you're dealing with a hoax or even a natural phenomenon. I think you've stumbled onto something that's been waiting underground for a very long time. And I think it's finally decided to make contact. That night, I made what may have been the most foolish decision of my career. I returned to Mrs. Henley's house with Dr. Webb, and we both crawled into the space beneath her kitchen. I wanted him to witness what I'd experienced, to confirm that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. We didn't have to wait long. At 1:58 a.m., the scratching began, but this time it was accompanied by something new, a series of sounds that could only be described as language. Not words in any human tongue, but communication nonetheless. Rising and falling tones that suggested questions and answers, conversations between multiple entities. Dr. Webb's face in the glow of our flashlight was a mixture of fascination and terror. He whispered notes into his recorder while the sounds continued around us, seeming to come from every direction. At 2:30 a.m., the dirt floor began to move. Not settling or shifting, but actually rising in places, as if something large were pressing up from below. We watched as the soil formed shapes, geometric patterns that held for several seconds before smoothing out again. That was when we heard the voice. It spoke in English, though the accent was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The words seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from any specific location. "We have been patient," it said. "We have waited while you built your houses above us. We have listened to your footsteps, your voices, your children's laughter. We have been patient, but our patience has limits." Dr. Webb and I looked at each other, both of us afraid to move or speak. "You will listen now," the voice continued. "You will hear our terms." The scratching sounds intensified, coming from all around us, above and below. I realized with growing horror that we were surrounded, that whatever was speaking to us wasn't alone. "We require acknowledgement," the voice said. "We require recognition of our prior claim to this place. We require cooperation." "What kind of cooperation?" Dr. Webb whispered, his academic curiosity overcoming his fear. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. When the voice spoke again, it sounded almost amused. "You will provide us with what we need to return to the surface. You will help us reclaim what was taken from us. And if we refuse?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "Then we will take what we need. We will start with the foundations of your houses. Then we will move to the foundations of your lives." The implications of that threat were lost on neither of us. If whatever was down there could undermine the structural integrity of the houses, it could collapse them at will. For families would be at the mercy of entities whose motivations and capabilities we couldn't begin to understand. "What do you want from us?" I asked. "Time," the voice replied. "And space. We want you to stop building above us. We want you to leave the old places alone. And we want you to remember that you are guests here, not owners." The scratching stopped abruptly, and the sweet smell began to fade. Within minutes, the crawl space returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after what we'd experienced. Dr. Webb and I emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, both of us shaking and covered in that peculiar dirt. We sat in my patrol car for 20 minutes without speaking, trying to process what had happened. "What do we do now?" Dr. Webb finally asked. It was a good question. How do you file a report about negotiating with subterranean entities? How do you explain to four families that their houses are built on top of something that considers them trespassers? I made a decision that I've questioned every day since. I told the affected families that we'd identified the source of the scratching, a rare geological phenomenon caused by settling limestone that created acoustical anomalies. I recommended they install additional insulation and white noise machines to mask the sounds, and I quietly arranged for the town to halt all new construction in the lower district indefinitely. The scratching continued for another 2 weeks, but it gradually became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. The four families reported that their sleep improved, and life in Millbrook returned to normal. Or as normal as it can be when you know something is waiting beneath your feet. Dr. Webb published a paper about geological acoustics in limestone substrates that became required reading for construction companies working in similar terrain. He never mentioned what we'd experienced under Mrs. Henley's house, and neither did I. That was 15 years ago. I retired 5 years later, turning over my badge to a young deputy who thought the strangest thing he'd ever deal with was drunk driving and domestic disputes. I never told him about the voices under the lower district, or about the agreement I had made in a crawl space at 2:30 in the morning. But sometimes, on still nights when the wind is just right, I can hear them. The scratching sounds, slow and deliberate, coming from beneath the streets of Millbrook. And I know they're still there, still waiting, still patient. The construction moratorium is still in effect, though the current town council doesn't know why. The official record's listed as a geological survey pending approval, and nobody's bothered to question it. The lower district has maintained its population of 4 families, and no new houses have been built there. Mrs. Henley passed away 3 years ago, but her niece inherited the house and moved in without any trouble. She's never mentioned hearing scratching sounds, and I hope she never will. Because I suspect the agreement we made wasn't permanent. I suspect it was more like a lease, and eventually the terms will come up for renegotiation. Sometimes I wonder what will happen when they do. Will the new sheriff be able to hear the voices coming from beneath the town? Will he be willing to listen to their terms? Will he understand that some problems can't be solved with handcuffs and paperwork? I've thought about writing it all down, leaving a record for whoever comes after me. But who would believe it? And maybe it's better if they discover the truth for themselves, the way I did, crawling through sweet-smelling dirt in the middle of the night, learning that the ground beneath a small town can hold more than anyone imagines. You hear it around 2 a.m. Scratching, slow. Always closer than the night before. And now you know what it means when something scratches back. We see 'em every fall. Dancing lights in the hills. And we bury whoever goes after 'em. That's what my grandfather told me when I first pinned on this badge 43 years ago. Same thing his grandfather told him when he wore the star before me. 3 generations of law in this county. And we all learned the same hard lesson. Some things in these hills ain't meant for civilized folks to understand. The town sits in a bowl between the ridges, like God scooped out a handful of earth and forgot to fill it back in. Streets run crooked because they follow the old deer paths, and the buildings lean into each other like they're sharing secrets. Population 2017 souls, according to the last census, though I suspect that number's been generous for years. People leave. They always do. But the ones who stay, well, they stay for reasons that don't make sense to outsiders. October is when the lights come. Always October, when the leaves turn and the air gets that sharp bite that makes your lungs hurt. They appear just after sunset, tiny pinpricks of yellow-white glow moving through the timber on the far ridge. Dancing, my grandfather called them, and I suppose that's as good a word as any. They bob and weave between the trees like fireflies, except fireflies don't burn that bright, and they sure as hell don't move in patterns that look almost deliberate. Most folks in town have learned not to look too long. They draw their curtains come evening and keep their children inside. The smart ones, anyway. There's always a few who think they know better. Usually outsiders who've moved here for the cheap real estate and the quiet life. They see the lights and think campfires, maybe hunters with lanterns. They think explanations. Sarah Manning thought explanations. She moved here 3 years back from the city, bought the old Hendricks place on Maple Street with money from her divorce settlement. Nice woman, maybe 45, worked as a freelance graphic designer on one of those computers. Kept to herself mostly, but friendly enough at the grocery store. The kind of transplant who might actually make it here, given time. She came into my office on a Tuesday morning in mid-October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and there was frost on the squad car windshields when I came in. She had that look people get when they're trying to sound reasonable about something that's eating at them from the inside. "Those lights," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "The ones up in the hills. I've been watching them for a week now." I set down my coffee and looked at her properly. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands moved restlessly in her lap like she couldn't quite get comfortable. "Have you now? They're not random. There's a pattern to how they move. Almost like they're searching for something." I'd heard this before. Not often, but enough to know where it led. "Mrs. Manning, those lights have been showing up here every October for longer than anyone can remember. Best thing is to just ignore them." "But what are they?" "Don't know. Don't need to know." She leaned forward, and I caught a whiff of something strange. Sweet, like flowers, but with an underlying note that reminded me of the way the air smells right before a lightning strike. "Sheriff, I'm not some hysterical city woman. I've been documenting them. Taking notes. They appear at 7:23 p.m. exactly, every night, from the same general area. And last night..." She paused, swallowed hard. "Last night I could swear I heard something. Like singing." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Singing. Faint. Beautiful. Coming from the direction of the lights. I was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. There was something different about her expression, something I'd seen before but couldn't quite place. A sort of dreamy distance, like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "Mrs. Manning, I'm going to give you some advice. Same advice my grandfather gave me, and his grandfather gave him. Those lights show up, you close your curtains. You don't look. You don't listen. And you sure as hell don't go chasing after them. But dash. No buts. This is important. There are things in these hills that are older than the town, older than the county. Things that don't take kindly to being disturbed." She stared at me like I'd started speaking in tongues. "You're talking about superstition. I'm talking about staying alive." But I could see in her eyes that she'd already made up her mind. That distant look was getting stronger, like she was being pulled towards something I couldn't see. I'd watched it happen before, and it never ended well. She left without saying goodbye. That evening, I drove up to Overlook Road, the closest you can get to the hill country by car. Parked at the turnoff and waited. The sun dropped behind the western ridge, painting the sky the color of old blood, and right on schedule the first light appeared. It started as a barely visible glow deep in the timber, maybe 2 miles up the slope. Then another joined it, and another, until there were maybe a dozen of them drifting between the trees like living stars. They moved with purpose, weaving patterns that hurt to look at directly. Made your eyes water and your head ache if you watched too long. And underneath the evening quiet, so faint I might have imagined it, came the sound of voices. I rolled up the windows and drove home. The next morning brought news I'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Mrs. Manning's neighbor called to report she hadn't seen her since yesterday evening. Her car was gone, but she'd left her purse on the kitchen counter and the back door standing wide open. I found the car easily enough. She'd driven as far up Mill Creek Road as the pavement would take her, then left it parked at the trailhead that led into the high country. Her footprints were clear in the soft earth beside the creek, heading uphill toward the place where the lights had been dancing. I followed the trail for maybe half a mile before the tracks left the established path and struck off through the underbrush. The further I went, the more wrong everything felt. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, even the insects seemed to have gone silent. The trees looked different too, older somehow, with bark that was nearly black and branches that twisted into shapes that made you look twice to make sure you weren't seeing faces in the wood. Her trail led steadily upward, through thickets that should have been impassable but showed clear signs of recent passage. Broken branches hung at shoulder height, and in several places I found scraps of fabric that matched the blue sweater she'd been wearing when she visited my office. But it was the smell that stopped me cold. Sweet. Floral. The same scent I'd noticed on her the day before, but stronger now. Concentrated. It hung in the air like invisible fog, and breathing it made me feel strange. Lightheaded. Like I was forgetting something important. I turned around and walked back to the car. That night the lights appeared earlier, and there were more of them. They danced closer to town too, visible from Main Street if you knew where to look. I patrolled the residential areas, making sure everyone was staying indoors, but I could see faces at windows and shadows on porches. The lights were calling to people, and some of them were starting to listen. 3 more went missing over the next week. Tom Brewster, who ran the hardware store, left his pickup truck at the same trailhead where I'd found Mrs. Manning's car. Betty Carmichael, the librarian, her reading glasses were discovered beside the creek, the lenses cracked like someone had stepped on them. And Marcus Chin, barely 18, who'd moved here with his family when his father took over the bank. Each time, the trail led up into the hills toward that sweet, flowery smell. And each time, I followed far enough to know they'd gone willingly, walking steadily uphill towards something that waited in the darkness between the trees. The state police wanted to organize search parties, bring in dogs and helicopters and teams of volunteers to comb the woods. I told them the terrain was too dangerous, that we'd handle it locally. They didn't push back too hard. Cases like this make everyone nervous. Missing persons with no logical explanation, no evidence of foul play, no demands for ransom. Just good people who walked into the woods and vanished like they'd never existed at all. The town started to feel hollow. Stores closed early. People hurried from their cars to their houses without looking at the hills. Children stopped playing outside after dark. At the diner, conversations dropped to whispers when anyone mentioned the lights, and more than once I caught folks stealing glances at me like they expected me to have answers I'd been keeping to myself. Maybe they were right. The truth is, there are stories about these hills that go back further than anyone wants to remember. Indian stories, from before the Cherokee were pushed out. They talked about spirits in the high places, beings that could call to human souls and lead them away from the world of the living. The early settlers had stories too. Warnings about dancing lights and voices in the dark that sounded like everything you'd ever lost calling your name. My great-grandfather kept a journal. Never talked about it while he was alive, but after he passed, my grandfather found it hidden in the bottom of an old trunk. Page after page of careful handwriting, documenting things that shouldn't have been possible. Lights that moved through the hills like living things. People who walked into the woods and were never seen again. And underneath it all, the growing certainty that whatever lived up there was patient, intelligent, and hungry. One entry, dated October 1892, still gives me chills. The Henderson boy came back today. Been gone 3 weeks. Found him walking down Main Street buck naked, covered in scratches, talking about the beautiful music. Had to lock him up for his own safety. He keeps trying to go back up the mountain. Says they're waiting for him. Says they showed him things. Wonderful things. God help us all. The Henderson boy hanged himself in his cell 2 days later. The journal mentioned others over the years. People who came back changed, speaking in whispers about lights that sang and promises of something better waiting in the darkness. Most of them found ways to return to the hills within a few days. The ones who didn't, well, they found other ways to stop the calling. By the middle of October, I'd started having the dreams. They always began the same way. I'd be standing at the edge of town, looking up at the hills, and the lights would appear. But in the dreams they were brighter, more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. They pulsed with colors that don't have names, and as they moved they left trails of light in the air like falling stars. And then I'd hear the singing. It wasn't like any music I could describe. Voices, but not human voices. They harmonized in ways that made my chest ache and my eyes fill with tears. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood their meaning. They were calling to me, welcoming me, promising me peace and wonder and an end to all the lonely years of keeping watch over this tired, forgotten place. In the dreams, I always started walking toward the lights. My feet moved without my permission, carrying me up into the hills where the air smelled like flowers and lightning. The closer I got, the more beautiful the singing became, until it filled my head completely and I couldn't remember why I'd ever been afraid. I'd wake up standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the hills, with my hand on the doorknob. The night after the fourth disappearance, I made a decision. I loaded my service weapon, grabbed a heavy flashlight, and drove up to Mill Creek Road. If I was going to lose my mind to whatever was calling from those hills, I wanted to at least see it face to face first. The trail was easy to follow in the dark. Not because I could see it, but because something inside me knew exactly where to go. The sweet smell grew stronger with every step, and underneath it I began to detect other scents. Wood smoke. Wild honey. Something else, darker and more complex, that reminded me of the way the air smells after a funeral. The beam of my flashlight caught things moving in the peripheral darkness. Shadows that seemed to shift and flow independent of the trees that cast them. Pale shapes that vanished the moment I turned the light directly on them. And always, just at the edge of hearing, the sound of voices singing in languages that predated human speech. The path led up a steep ridge and then down into a narrow valley I'd never seen on any county map. At the bottom, in a clearing surrounded by trees so old their trunks disappeared into the darkness above, I found what I'd been looking for. They stood in a circle around a depression in the earth. Mrs. Manning, Tom Brewster, Betty Carmichael, young Marcus Chin. Others too, people I didn't recognize but who had the look of locals from decades past. They all faced inward, toward the center of the circle, and their faces. God help me, their faces were serene, peaceful, like they'd finally found something they'd been searching for their entire lives. In the center of the circle, rising from what looked like a natural spring, was light. Not the dancing lights I'd seen from town, but something else entirely. Pure illumination that hurt to look at directly but filled me with longing when I tried to turn away. It pulsed in rhythm with the singing, which was coming from the gathered people, though their mouths never moved. I tried to speak, to call out to Mrs. Manning, but my voice wouldn't work. The light was pulling at something deep inside me, something I hadn't even known existed. It promised an end to questions without answers, to nights spent wondering what shadows moved in the corners of my vision. It promised belonging. I took a step forward. Then another. The circle of people began to turn toward me, and I saw their eyes. Empty sockets filled with the same beautiful light that rose from the spring. They smiled with mouths that were too wide, and when they spoke my name it was in voices that harmonized impossibly with the singing that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when I ran. I don't remember getting back to the car. I remember crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my uniform, my flashlight beams spinning wildly through the trees. I remember the sound of pursuit behind me, not footsteps but something else, like wind moving through leaves or water flowing over stone. And always, always, the singing followed me, growing fainter but never quite disappearing entirely. I drove straight to the state police barracks and requested immediate assistance. Told them I'd found evidence of cult activity in the hills, that missing persons were being held against their will. They organized a response team and followed me back up Mill Creek Road at first light. We found nothing. The trail I'd followed was overgrown and barely passable. The clearing where I'd seen the circle of people was just another patch of woods, no different from thousands of others in these hills. No spring, no unusual lights, no signs that anyone had been there recently. The state investigators spent 3 days combing the area. They found some old campsites and the remains of a few hunting cabins, but nothing that would explain the disappearances. Eventually they filed their reports and moved on to cases that made more sense. But I knew what I'd seen. The dreams continued for weeks afterward. The same beautiful lights, the same impossible music, the same promises of peace and understanding. But now there was something else in them. A note of impatience. The lights burned brighter, and the singing carried an edge of longing that made my bones ache. They were waiting for me to come back. I started sleeping with the lights on. Started wearing a small silver cross my grandmother had given me, even though I hadn't been to church in 20 years. Started avoiding the windows that faced the hills and made sure I was never alone after sunset. It helped, but it didn't stop the calling entirely. October ended, and the lights stopped appearing. The missing people were declared legally dead after the required waiting period. Their families held memorial services and tried to move on with their lives. The town settled back into its usual rhythms, and by Christmas most folks had stopped talking about what had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. The next October, the lights came back. Earlier this time, and brighter. They appeared not just in the distant hills but closer to town, dancing at the edges of the residential areas like they were testing boundaries. And with them came new disappearances. 2 college students who'd been camping at the state park. An elderly woman who'd lived alone on the outskirts of town. A trucker who'd stopped for gas and never made it back to his rig. This time I didn't go looking for them. I knew where they'd gone, and I knew what had happened to them. Instead, I did what my grandfather had done, and his grandfather before him. I kept people away from the hills. I discouraged camping and hiking during October. I made sure everyone understood that some parts of the county were off limits after dark. Most years it worked. Most years, we only lost 1 or 2. Usually outsiders who didn't listen to warnings or locals who thought they knew better. But some years were worse than others. Some years the lights came down almost to Main Street, and people would walk out of their houses in the middle of the night and head for the hills like they were following invisible leashes. I never told anyone what I'd seen in that clearing. How could I? Who would believe that somewhere up in these hills, in a place that exists only when the lights are dancing, there's a circle of people who found exactly what they were looking for? That they stand around something beautiful and terrible and sing without words in voices that carry further than sound should travel? Sometimes, on the worst October nights, I can still hear them. The singing gets stronger every year. More insistent. And sometimes I wonder if what I saw in Mrs. Manning's eyes that day in my office is starting to show in mine. If people can tell that I'm listening to something they can't hear, watching for lights that promise answers to questions I'm afraid to ask. I'm 67 now, and my hands shake when I pour my morning coffee. The young deputy who works under me has started giving me looks when he thinks I'm not paying attention. Concerned looks. The kind of looks you give someone who's starting to slip away from the world of the living. Maybe he's right. Maybe it's time to stop fighting what I've known all along. That whatever waits in those hills isn't evil, exactly. It's something older than good and evil, older than human concepts of right and wrong. It's a place where lost things go to be found, where questions finally get answers, where the music never stops and the light never fades. They're calling to me again tonight. The lights appeared right after sunset, and this time they're close enough to see from my front porch. They pulse in rhythm with something deep in my chest, and when I close my eyes I can see the path that leads up into the hills as clearly as if it were painted on the inside of my eyelids. Mrs. Manning is waiting for me there. I can feel her presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. She's been patient, but her patience is wearing thin. They all are. Tom Brewster and Betty Carmichael and young Marcus Chin and all the others who've made the journey before me. They're singing my name now, harmonizing it with voices that sound like wine through autumn leaves and water over stone. The sound is beautiful. More beautiful than anything I've ever heard. I think it's time to stop running from it. The badge sits heavy on my chest as I reach for the door. 3 generations of law in this county. And we all learned the same lesson in the end. Some things in these hills are older than fear, older than duty, older than the promises we make to keep the peace. Some things are worth walking toward, even when you know you'll never walk back. The lights are dancing closer now, and their music fills the October air with promises of rest. Behind me, the town sleeps peacefully, trusting that someone is standing watch. And someone is. Someone always has been. Just not in the way they think. I open the door and step into the night. The sweet smell of flowers and lightning fills my lungs, and for the first time in 43 years, I feel like I'm going home. Above me, the lights dance their ancient patterns, and I begin to walk toward them. Toward the music. Toward the place where all the missing people wait with empty eyes and perfect smiles, singing songs in languages that were old when the world was young. Behind me, the radio crackles with a call from dispatch. A concerned citizen reporting strange lights in the hills. My deputy's voice, young and uncertain, asking for instructions. But I'm already too far away to answer. Already walking up the path I've seen in dreams for so many years, following footsteps that have worn the way smooth over decades of pilgrims who came before me. The lights grow brighter with every step, and the singing grows sweeter, and somewhere in the darkness ahead I can see the outline of a circle where people stand around something that pulses with the rhythm of creation itself. They're waiting for me. They've always been waiting. And finally, I'm ready to answer their call. The October wind carries my voice back down the hill, joining the harmony that has echoed through these valleys for longer than anyone can remember. In the morning, they'll find my truck parked at the trailhead and my badge sitting on the driver's seat. They'll search for me, just like they searched for all the others. But they won't find anything except empty woods and the lingering scent of flowers. Because some things in these hills are meant to stay hidden. Some lights are meant to be followed. And some songs, once you hear them clearly, are meant to be sung forever. We see 'em every fall. Dancing lights in the hills, and we bury whoever comes back to tell about them. When that bell tolls, something always dies before sunrise. That's what my grandmother used to say, back when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and she'd rock on her porch in the evenings, watching the old Presbyterian church across the way. Course, back then the church still had congregants, still had that preacher with the wandering eye and the habit of breathing too close when he shook your hand after service. But even then, even when the building was alive with hymns and potluck dinners, that bell had a weight to it that pressed down on the whole town like a thumb on a scale. I'm Sheriff Thomas Hawthorne, been wearing this badge for 37 years come October. Seen my share of peculiar things in Millbrook. Drunk drivers wrapped around telephone poles, domestic disputes that turned uglier than they had any right to, and the occasional vagrant who'd wander in from the interstate with stories that made your skin crawl. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened during those 3 weeks in September of '89. The old Presbyterian church had been empty for near on 4 decades by then. Built in 1847 out of fieldstone hauled from the quarry 5 miles north, it sat on Elm Street like a rotten tooth in an otherwise decent smile. The congregation had dwindled through the 50s and 60s, what with young folks moving to the cities and old-timers passing on to whatever reward awaited them. By 1949, there weren't enough bodies to fill even the front pews, and the church board made the decision to sell. Problem was, nobody wanted to buy it. Oh, there'd been interest over the years. A developer from Albany looked at it in '62, talked about turning it into apartments. A family from Massachusetts wanted to convert it into an antique shop in '74. But something always went wrong. Contracts fell through. Financing dried up. The developer's wife took sick with something the doctors couldn't name, and the family from Massachusetts, well, they just stopped returning calls. So the church sat empty, windows boarded up, weeds growing through the foundation stones. The bell tower stood 43 feet high, that bronze bell hanging silent in its wooden cradle, rope long since rotted away. Town council talked about tearing the whole thing down every few years, but somehow the motion never quite made it to a vote. Should have known that was the first sign something wasn't right. The trouble started on a Tuesday. I remember because it was garbage day, and I was making my usual rounds through the residential streets, checking on things, when Mrs. Eldridge flagged me down outside the post office. She was 84 then, sharp as a tack despite her years, ran the town library for near on 50 years before retiring. "Sheriff," she said, clutching her purse against her chest like it held the crown jewels, "that bell rang last night." I parked the cruiser and stepped out, feeling the September heat settle on my shoulders like a wool blanket. "Which bell would that be, Mrs. Eldridge?" She pointed a gnarled finger toward Elm Street. "The church bell. Woke me right out of a sound sleep at the stroke of midnight." Now, I'd lived in Millbrook my whole life, 46 years at that point, and I knew that bell hadn't rung since Eisenhower was in office. The mechanism was rusted solid, the rope was gone, and there wasn't a soul alive who had any business being up in that tower. "Could have been the Catholic Church," I suggested. "Or maybe the Methodist." "Don't patronize me, Thomas Hawthorne." Mrs. Eldridge's voice carried the same steel that had kept generations of Millbrook children in line during story hour. "I know the sound of that Presbyterian bell same as I know my own heartbeat. Deep and mournful, like it's calling souls to judgment. Rang 12 times, slow and deliberate." I assured her I'd look into it, but frankly, I figured she'd been dreaming. 84-year-old woman, living alone in that big house, mind playing tricks. Happens to the best of us as we get on in years. That evening, I drove past the church on my way home. Looked same as always. Windows boarded up tight, iron fence around the property sagging in places, that for sale sign so faded you could barely make out the realtor's name. The bell tower rose against the darkening sky like an accusation, but everything was quiet. Everything was still. I was settling into my recliner with a beer and the evening news when the phone rang. Dispatcher's voice was tight with something that might have been nervousness. "Sheriff, we got another call about that bell. Mrs. Patterson on Oak Street says it woke her baby." Mrs. Patterson lived clear on the other side of town from Mrs. Eldridge. If they were both hearing the same thing. "Tell her I'll check it out," I said, already reaching for my hat. I drove through the empty streets with the windows down, listening. Millbrook at night was usually quiet as a grave, just the hum of streetlights and the distant whisper of wind through the cornfields that surrounded us like a green sea. But there was something else that night, something underneath the usual sounds. A tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. I parked across from the church and sat in the cruiser, engine ticking as it cooled. The building hunched against the darkness, black windows reflecting nothing. I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m. At exactly midnight, the bell began to toll. The sound hit me like a physical thing, deep and resonant, seeming to come from the very stones beneath my feet rather than the tower above. 12 measured strikes, each one hanging in the air long enough to overlap with the next, creating a harmony that made my teeth ache. The bronze voice called out across the sleeping town, and I swear I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, in places that had no name. I sat frozen in that cruiser, hands gripping the steering wheel, until the last echo died away. Then I grabbed my flashlight and got out. The iron gate stood open. I know for a fact that gate had been locked for 40 years. The town had the only key, kept in the drawer of the clerk's desk at City Hall. But there it was, hanging loose on its hinges, creaking slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The church door was open too. I'd like to say I marched right up those steps and into that building, badge blazing, fear be damned. Truth is, I stood at the bottom of those stone steps for the better part of 10 minutes, playing that flashlight beam over the open doorway, trying to see into the darkness beyond. The air coming out of that church smelled wrong, not just musty or stale, but something deeper. Something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. When I finally climbed those steps, each one seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the sound were bouncing around in spaces much larger than the church could contain. The door was solid oak, original to the building, and it should have been swollen tight after 40 years of weather. Instead, it swung open at my touch, smooth as silk. Inside, my flashlight beam revealed the same abandoned sanctuary I glimpsed through broken boards over the years. Pews still stood in neat rows, though mice had made nests in the cushions and woodworms had carved intricate patterns in the oak. The altar remained at the front, simple and stark, with the baptismal font off to one side. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust that my footsteps disturbed, creating small clouds that danced in the flashlight beam. But the dust told a story. There were other footprints. Lots of them. Leading down the center aisle toward the altar, then branching off toward the narrow door that led to the bell tower. Bare feet, mostly, though some looked like they might have been made by shoes. Different sizes, different shapes. Some so small they could have belonged to children. I followed the tracks to the tower door, which stood ajar. The wooden stairs beyond were steep and narrow, disappearing up into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The smell was stronger here, that sweet, cloying scent that seemed to coat the inside of my nose and throat. I started up those stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, and more than once I had to grab the rough wooden rail to keep from slipping. The walls were close enough that I could touch both sides with my outstretched arms, and they seemed to press inward as I climbed, though I knew that was just my imagination playing tricks. The bell chamber was a circular room maybe 12 feet across, with arched openings on 4 sides that would have let the sound carry across the town. The great bronze bell hung in the center, suspended from thick wooden beams that looked original to the building. It should have been green with verdigris after all these years, but instead it gleamed like it had been polished that very day. There was no rope, no mechanism, no way for that bell to ring. But it had rung. I'd heard it myself, felt it in my bones. And as I stood there in that close, sweet-smelling air, I noticed something else. The dust up here was different, thinner. And in the center of the floor, directly beneath the bell, was a circle where no dust lay at all. The wooden planks were clean, as if they'd been swept or worn smooth. I bent down and touched the wood. It was warm. That's when I heard the voices. Soft at first, like whispers carried on wind. Coming from below, from the sanctuary. Multiple voices, though I couldn't make out words. Just a low murmur, like the sound of conversation from another room. I crept to one of the arch openings and looked down. The sanctuary was full. Every pew held figures, maybe 60 or 70 of them, sitting in perfect silence. My flashlight couldn't reach that far, and the moonlight filtering through the gaps in the boarded windows was too dim to make out faces. But I could see the shapes, the suggestion of heads and shoulders, the pale glimmer of what might have been skin or cloth. And they were all looking up at me. I don't remember climbing down those stairs. Next thing I knew, I was standing in the sanctuary doorway, flashlight beams sweeping across empty pews. Nothing. Nobody. Just dust and shadows and that sweet, sick smell. But on the floor of the center aisle, clear as day in the dust, were the tracks I'd seen before. Only now there were more of them. Many more. A congregation's worth of bare feet, leading from every pew toward the altar. I got out of there. Locked the gate behind me, though I knew it wouldn't stay locked. Drove home with my windows up and my radio turned loud, trying to drown out the echo of that bell that seemed to still be ringing somewhere inside my skull. The next morning, I called the realtor whose name was on that faded sign. took 3 tries to track him down. Turns out he'd moved to Phoenix 10 years earlier and never bothered to update his listings. When I finally reached him, he sounded older than dirt and not particularly interested in discussing old business. That church? His voice was thin and reedy over the long-distance connection. Haven't thought about that place in years. Strangest damn thing, though. Never could sell it. What do you mean? Well, we'd get interest from time to time. Show the property, draw up contracts. But something always went wrong at the last minute. Buyers would change their minds, or their financing would fall through, or... He paused, and I could hear him breathing heavily. Or they just disappear. Disappear? Stop returning calls. Stop answering their doors. Like they just up and vanished. Happened 6 or 7 times over the years. Finally, I stopped trying. Figured the place would sell itself when it was ready. I asked him about the history of the building, whether there'd been any unusual incidents when it was still an active church. Another long pause. There were stories, he said finally. Old-timers used to whisper about things that happened back in the 20s and 30s. People going missing during services. Folks claiming they'd seen their dead relatives sitting in the pews. But you know how small towns are. People talk. What kind of stories? The kind you don't repeat if you want to sleep at night. The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Sheriff, if you're smart, you'll leave that place alone. Some doors are meant to stay closed. He hung up before I could ask any more questions. That afternoon, I drove over to the county seat and spent hours in the records office, digging through old newspapers and property documents. What I found made my blood run cold. The Presbyterian church had been built on the site of an earlier structure, a meeting house that dated back to the 1790s. That building had burned in 1846, along with most of the original congregation. 37 people had died in that fire, including the pastor and his entire family. The cause was never determined, but witnesses reported that the bell had continued ringing even as the flames consumed the tower. They'd built the new church on the same foundation, using some of the original stones. The bell was new, cast in Boston and shipped by rail, but there were reports from the very beginning that it sounded wrong. Too deep, too mournful. Like it was calling to the dead instead of the living. The disappearances had started in 1923. Members of the congregation would simply stop showing up to services. Their families would find their beds unslept in, their belongings undisturbed, but the people themselves would be gone without a trace. Always happened after the bell had been heard ringing at midnight, not during regular services, but in the dead of night when no one should have been in the building. By 1949, the congregation was down to fewer than a dozen members, all of them elderly, all of them too frightened to enter the church after dark. The final service was held on a Sunday in October, and the building was sealed the following week. But the bell kept ringing. Reports came in sporadically over the years, usually around the anniversary of the original fire. Midnight tolling that woke half the town, though no one could ever explain how a bell with no rope and no mechanism could ring on its own. Most folks learned to ignore it, to pull their pillows over their heads and wait for dawn. Until people started disappearing again. I found the records buried in a box of cold case files. Between 1962 and 1987, 17 people had vanished from Millbrook under circumstances that defied explanation. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication they'd left town voluntarily. Just gone, as if they'd never existed at all. The only common thread was timing. Every disappearance happened within 24 hours of someone reporting that they'd heard the church bell ring at midnight. I was studying those files when my deputy knocked on my office door. Jake Thornton, good kid, been working for me about 3 years. He looked pale and shaken, like he'd seen something that didn't agree with his breakfast. "Sheriff, we got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The Hendricks boy. Tommy. His mother called in about an hour ago, says he never came home last night." Tommy Hendricks was 16, star of the high school baseball team, good grades, never been in any real trouble. Not the type to run away or stay out all night without calling. "Any idea where he might have gone?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "His girlfriend says he was walking her home around 11 last night. She lives on Elm Street, about 2 blocks from the old church. Says they heard something as he was leaving her place." My stomach dropped. "What did they hear?" "A bell ringing. 12 times, real slow and deep." I sent Jake to canvass the neighborhood while I drove back to the church. The gate was open again, hanging loose on its hinges despite the fact that I'd locked it tight the night before. The front door stood ajar, and that sweet, sickening smell drifted out on the afternoon breeze. Inside, the sanctuary looked the same as always: empty pews, dust-covered altar, shafts of sunlight cutting through gaps in the boarded windows. But there were new tracks in the dust. Fresh ones. Leading from the front door down the center aisle to the altar, then branching off toward the bell tower. Sneaker prints this time. Size 11, with the distinctive tread pattern of basketball shoes. Tommy Hendricks wore size 11 Nikes. I'd seen him often enough around town to know. The tracks led up the tower stairs, clear as day in the accumulated dust. At the top, in the bell chamber, I found something that made my hands shake as I held the flashlight. Tommy's varsity jacket was hanging from one of the wooden support beams. Hanging neat and clean, like someone had carefully folded it and placed it there for safekeeping. But there was no sign of Tommy himself. I called in the state police, though I couldn't tell them the whole truth. How do you explain that a boy disappeared into a building that's been empty for 40 years? How do you describe footprints that lead up a tower but not back down? How do you make sense of a bronze bell that rings without a rope, calling out to something that waits in the darkness between worlds? The state investigators found nothing. No evidence of foul play, no indication that Tommy had been in the building at all. They suggested he might have dropped the jacket earlier, that someone else could have placed it in the tower as a prank. They took statements, filed reports, and went back to the Capitol, leaving me with more questions than answers. That night I sat in my cruiser across from the church, watching and waiting. The building hunched against the darkness like a living thing, patient and hungry. At 11:58 I saw movement in one of the upper windows, just a shadow passing behind the boards, but enough to make my skin crawl. At midnight the bell rang again. 12 measured tolls, each one seeming to resonate in my bones. And as the sound died away, I saw them. Figures moving through the churchyard, approaching from all directions. Men, women, children, dozens of them, walking with the slow, deliberate pace of sleepwalkers. Some wore clothes from decades past, others were dressed in modern attire. All of them were heading for the church. I recognized faces in that crowd. Mrs. Pemberton, who disappeared in 1973. The Morrison twins, last seen in 1981. And there, near the back of the group, Tommy Hendricks, still wearing his baseball uniform. They filed through the front door in perfect silence, disappearing into the darkness beyond. I waited, heart hammering, for some sign of what was happening inside. But the church gave up no secrets, just sat there like it had for 40 years, keeping its own counsel. When dawn broke, they were gone. All of them. The church was empty again, the gate locked tight, no sign that anything unusual had happened. But I knew better. I knew that somewhere, in spaces that existed between what was and what could be, those lost souls were still walking toward an altar that hungered for more than prayers. I've been sheriff of Millbrook for 37 years, and I've learned to live with things that don't make sense. But every September, when the nights start getting longer and the air turns crisp with the promise of winter, I find myself listening for the sound of bronze on bronze. Because when that bell tolls, something always dies before sunrise. And I'm starting to suspect that something might be the town itself. The disappearances have stopped for now. It's been 6 years since Tommy Hendricks walked into that church and never walked out. 6 years since I've heard that midnight bell calling across the sleeping houses of Millbrook. But the church is still there, still waiting, still patient as death itself. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I drive past Elm Street and Park where I can see the bell tower. The building looks the same as always, abandoned, forgotten, harmless. But I know better. I know that inside those stone walls, in chambers that exist outside the normal flow of time, a congregation gathers every midnight to worship something that feeds on the spaces between heartbeats. The for sale sign is gone now. Took it down myself 3 years ago, when I realized that some things aren't meant to be owned by the living. Let the weeds grow through the foundation stones. Let the boards rot over the windows. Let time and weather do what human hands cannot. Because I've seen what happens when that door opens. I've heard the voices calling from the bell tower, sweet and terrible as sin itself. And I know that somewhere in the darkness, 49 souls are waiting for the 50 that will complete their number. When that bell tolls, something always dies before sunrise. My grandmother was right about that. She was right about everything. There's a part of those woods where even the birds won't fly. And God help the poor soul that wanders in. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 37 years now, and in all that time, I've learned to trust my instincts about places that feel wrong. This town sits in a valley carved out by glaciers millennia ago, surrounded by hills thick with oak and pine that stretch for miles in every direction. Most of it's good forest, the kind that feeds your soul when you walk through it, where sunlight filters down through the canopy, and you can hear the whisper of wind through leaves that's been the same since before man ever set foot here. But not all of it. The locals call it Dead Hollow, though you won't find that name on any map. It's maybe 40 acres of woodland about 6 miles northeast of town, nestled in a depression between two ridges like a scab on the earth's skin. The trees there grow differently, twisted, stunted things that seem to lean away from some invisible center, their bark black and smooth as a burned victim's skin. The ground beneath them is bare dirt, hard-packed and gray, without so much as a blade of grass or a single wildflower. I first heard about the place when I was still a deputy, back in '87. Old Sheriff Hawkins mentioned it in passing during one of his rambling stories about the county's history. Said his grandfather had warned him about it, and his grandfather's grandfather before that. Generations of lawmen in this county, all passing down the same advice: stay away from Dead Hollow. Don't go in after dark. Don't go in alone. Better yet, don't go in at all. Like most young men, I thought it was just small-town superstition. Mountain folk love their ghost stories, their tales of cursed ground and restless spirits. Every holler has its haunted house, every crossroads its devil's bargain. I filed it away with all the other local folklore and forgot about it. Until the Henderson boy went missing. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of crisp autumn day that makes you grateful to be alive. The maples were turning, painting the hills in shades of gold and crimson, and the air had that clean bite that comes just before the first frost. I was in my office going through paperwork when Martha Henderson called, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that only comes from a mother whose child hasn't come home. Her boy Tommy was 14, the kind of kid who knew every deer trail and fishing hole in 50 square miles. He'd left that morning to check his rabbit snares, something he'd done 100 times before. Should have been back by noon. It was past 4 when she called. I took Deputy Mills with me, and we started at the Henderson place, a weathered farmhouse that had been in the family for 4 generations. Martha met us on the porch, wringing her hands in her apron. Her husband Jake stood behind her, jaw set in that way men get when they're trying not to show fear. "He knows these woods better than anyone," Martha kept saying. "He wouldn't get lost. He just wouldn't." We followed Tommy's trail easily enough at first. The boy had left clear sign, bent branches, disturbed leaves, the occasional boot print in soft soil. Mills was good at tracking, had learned it from his Cherokee grandmother, and he led us deeper into the woods with the confidence of a man reading a familiar book. The trail led us northeast, away from the main logging roads and hunting paths, into the older part of the forest where the trees grew thick and the shadows ran deep even in afternoon light. We walked for maybe 2 hours, calling Tommy's name, listening for any sound that might lead us to him. That's when we found his backpack. It was hanging from a low branch about 10 feet off the ground, suspended by one strap like someone had thrown it there. Mills had to climb up to get it down, and when he did, we both noticed something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The pack was bone dry, but everything else in that part of the forest was soaked with dew. The leaves, the tree trunks, even the ground, all of it glistening with moisture except for that backpack. Inside we found Tommy's lunch, untouched, and his compass. The compass was the thing that really got to me. Tommy carried that compass everywhere, had since he was 10 years old. It was a gift from his grandfather, a old brass thing that still worked perfect. But when I held it up, the needle spun lazy circles, never settling on any direction. "Equipment malfunction," Mills said, but his voice didn't carry much conviction. We were standing there puzzling over the compass when I noticed the silence. In 30 years of walking these woods, I'd never heard such complete quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Even the wind seemed to die away to nothing. It was like standing in a cathedral made of living wood, but one where all the prayers had been answered with silence. Mills noticed it too. He kept turning his head, listening for something that wasn't there. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "where exactly are we?" I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The trees here were different, older maybe, but wrong somehow. Their bark was too smooth, too dark, and they grew in patterns that didn't look natural. They seemed to lean inward, creating a canopy so thick that only the faintest light filtered through. That's when I realized we were standing at the edge of Dead Hollow. I'd never seen it before, but I knew it instinctively, the way you know a familiar face even in poor light. The ground ahead of us sloped downward into a depression that looked like a giant's thumbprint pressed into the earth. The trees grew smaller as they descended, becoming twisted, stunted things that barely deserved the name. And beneath them, that hard-packed dirt I'd heard about, gray as old bones and completely barren. "We need to get out of here," I said. Mills looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Sheriff, what if the boy's down there?" "He's not." "How can you be sure?" I couldn't explain it then, and I'm not sure I can explain it now. It was just a feeling, deep in my gut, that nothing living could survive in that place. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a presence unto itself, something that pushed against you like a weight. But Mills was right about one thing. We had to be sure. We started down the slope, and with each step, the wrongness of the place became more apparent. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and it carried a smell that I can only describe as the scent of something very old and very sick. Not decay, exactly, but something worse, the smell of something that had never been alive to begin with. The trees on either side of us were barely more than saplings, but their trunks were gnarled and twisted like arthritic fingers. Their leaves, What few they had were a sickly yellow-green, and they rustled with a sound like paper being crumpled. Some of the branches had grown together in impossible ways, creating shapes that hurt to look at directly. We were maybe 50 yards down the slope when Mills stopped suddenly. "Sheriff," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at the ground." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The hard-packed dirt was covered with footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They led in all directions, overlapping and crisscrossing in patterns that made no sense. Some were fresh, some were old, and some looked like they'd been pressed into the earth with impossible force. But here's the thing that still wakes me up at night. They were all different sizes, different shapes, different depths. Like they'd been made by different people, walking at different times, maybe different seasons. But they all led in the same direction, deeper into the hollow, toward the center where the trees grew smallest and the shadows were darkest. And none of them led back out. Mills knelt down and studied the prints more closely. "Sheriff, some of these, they don't look right." He was right. Some of the prints were too deep, like they'd been made by someone carrying an enormous weight. Others were too shallow, as if the person making them had been lighter than air. And some of them, well, some of them weren't quite the right shape for human feet. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." But when we turned to go back up the slope, something made me look over my shoulder one last time. Deep in the hollow, where the shadows were thickest, I saw a flash of movement. Something pale and quick, darting between the twisted trees. For just a moment, I thought I saw Tommy Henderson standing there, perfectly still, watching us with eyes that reflected the dim light like an animal's. But when I blinked, there was nothing there but shadows and silence. We climbed out of that hollow like our lives depended on it, and maybe they did. By the time we reached the ridge, we were both breathing hard and covered in sweat despite the cool air. Mills kept looking back over his shoulder, and I noticed his hand resting on his service weapon. "We need to call for a search and rescue team," he said. "No. Sheriff, we can't send anyone else down there." I couldn't explain it to him then, just like I couldn't explain it to Martha and Jake Henderson when we returned to their farmhouse empty-handed. How do you tell parents that their child has wandered into a place where the very ground seems to hunger for human footsteps? How do you explain that you've seen something that shouldn't exist, in a place that maps refuse to acknowledge? We organized a proper search the next day, but I made sure to keep the teams away from Dead Hollow. We covered every other square mile of forest in the county, brought in dogs and volunteers and even a helicopter from the state police. For 3 days we searched, and for 3 days we found nothing. On the 4th day, Tommy Henderson walked out of the woods. I was in my office when the call came in. Martha Henderson, crying and laughing at the same time, telling me her boy was home. I drove out there fast as I could, expecting to find a confused, frightened kid who'd gotten lost and spent 3 days finding his way home. Instead, I found something else entirely. Tommy was sitting on the porch steps, clean and calm and completely unharmed. His clothes weren't torn or dirty, he wasn't dehydrated or hungry, and he showed no signs of having spent 3 days in the wilderness. He looked like he'd just stepped out of his bedroom. But his eyes were different. They were still blue, still the same shape and size, but they looked deeper somehow. Older. Like he'd seen things that no 14-year-old boy should see, things that had aged him from the inside out. "Where have you been, son?" I asked him. He looked at me for a long moment, and I had the strangest feeling that he was trying to remember not where he'd been, but who I was. "Walking," he said finally. "Walking where?" "In the woods. There's a place down in the hollow where the trees grow backwards and the ground remembers every step that's ever been taken on it. I've been there before lots of times. We all have." The way he said, "we all," made my skin crawl. "Who's we, Tommy?" He smiled then, and it was the most unsettling smile I've ever seen. Not because it was evil or malicious, but because it was perfectly, completely empty. "The others," he said. "The ones who went walking and decided to stay." Martha Henderson wrapped her arms around her son and held him tight, tears streaming down her face. She didn't hear the wrongness in his voice, didn't see the way his eyes never quite focused on anything in the here and now. All she saw was her boy, home safe. But Jake Henderson saw it. I could tell by the way he looked at Tommy, like he was seeing a stranger wearing his son's face. Tommy lived another 6 months after that, and in all that time, he never quite seemed to be all there. He'd sit for hours staring out his bedroom window toward the woods, and sometimes his parents would find him sleepwalking, always heading in the same direction, northeast, toward Dead Hollow. The strange thing was, he wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other kids in town acting peculiar. Sarah Coleman, who'd been one of Tommy's closest friends, began having nightmares about walking in circles through dark woods. Little Billy Patterson started drawing pictures of trees that grew downward, their roots reaching toward the sky. And Melissa Grant, who was only 8 years old, asked her mother why some people's footprints followed them home. It was like whatever had happened to Tommy in that hollow was spreading, infecting other children with memories of a place they'd never been. Then came the night Tommy disappeared for good. It was a Tuesday in April, almost 6 months to the day since he'd first gone missing. His parents woke up to find his bedroom window open and their son gone. This time, there was no search. I knew where he'd gone, and I knew he wouldn't be coming back. But I had to see for myself. I went alone this time, against every instinct I had. I parked my cruiser at the old logging road and walked the same path Mills and I had taken months before. The woods were different in spring, green and alive, full of birdsong and the rustle of small animals. But as I got closer to Dead Hollow, the sounds faded away until I was walking in that familiar, oppressive silence. The hollow looked exactly the same. Same twisted trees, same hard-packed earth, same feeling of wrongness that made your skin crawl. But now there were fresh footprints in the dirt, small ones, child-sized, leading down into the depths of the depression. I followed them. The path wound between the stunted trees, always heading deeper, always descending. The air grew thicker with each step, and that sick smell grew stronger. It wasn't just the scent of something old and wrong anymore. Now it carried hints of something else. Something that might have been human once, but wasn't anymore. I followed those footprints for what felt like hours, though my watch insisted only minutes had passed. The hollow seemed to stretch on forever, deeper and wider than it had any right to be. The trees grew stranger as I went, their branches forming shapes that reminded me of human limbs, human faces, human figures frozen in moments of desperate reaching. Then I saw them. They were standing in a clearing at the heart of the hollow, maybe 20 or 30 figures arranged in a perfect circle. At first glance, they looked like children, the right height, the right general shape. But as I got closer, I could see they were wrong in ways that made my mind rebel against what my eyes were showing me. They were too still, for one thing. Not even breathing, just standing there like statues. And their skin had a waxy, translucent quality, like it was made of something that had never been alive. But the worst part was their faces. They were smooth, featureless, as if someone had started to sculpt human features but had given up halfway through. All except one. Tommy Henderson stood at the center of the circle, and he still looked like himself. But his eyes were completely black now, and when he smiled at me, I could see that his teeth had grown into sharp points. "Sheriff," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the clearing despite the distance between us. I wondered when you'd come walking. Tommy, you need to come home. Your parents are worried sick. He laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes made of bone. This is home now. This is where all the lost children come to stay. Where we learn to be what we were always meant to be. What happened to you, son? I remembered, he said. I remembered all the times I'd walked these woods, all the times I'd felt the ground calling to me. The hollow doesn't just take you. It makes you remember that you were already taken, long ago. Every child in this county has walked these paths in their dreams. We all have. And someday, when we're ready, we come home. The figures around him began to move then, turning to face me with their blank, unfinished faces. They didn't walk so much as glide, their feet never quite touching the ground. You can stay too, Sheriff, Tommy said. You've been walking these woods for years. You've felt the pull, haven't you? The way the trees whisper your name when you're alone? The way the paths seem to lead you deeper than you meant to go? And God help me, he was right. I had felt it, every time I'd walked these woods. A subtle tugging, like an invisible hand on my sleeve, always trying to lead me somewhere I didn't want to go. I know what you are, I said, backing away slowly. Do you? Because I'm not sure I do. I remember being Tommy Henderson, but I also remember being a dozen other children, walking these same paths, finding this same clearing. I remember being the first child to ever set foot in this hollow, back when the world was young and the trees were saplings. I remember being all of them, and none of them, and something else entirely. The figures were closer now, close enough that I could see they weren't quite solid. They flickered like heat mirages, and their edges blurred into the shadows between the trees. The hollow is old, Sheriff. Older than the county, older than the state, older than the tribes that lived here before the white man came. It's been collecting children for centuries, adding them to its collection. And when the collection is complete, when every child who was ever meant to be here has found their way home, then the hollow will be ready to start collecting something else. What? Tommy's black eyes fixed on mine, and his smile widened. Everyone else. I ran then, turned and ran like the devil himself was after me. Behind me, I could hear laughter, not just Tommy's voice, but dozens of them, the voices of all the lost children echoing through the hollow. I ran through the twisted trees, stumbling over roots and branches, following the slope upward toward the light. But the path kept changing. Branches that had been on my left were suddenly on my right. Trees I'd passed minutes before appeared ahead of me again. The hollow was playing with me, showing me that it could keep me as long as it wanted. It was only when I stopped trying to find my way out, and started walking in the direction that felt most wrong that I finally escaped. The hollow wanted me to stay, but it wasn't quite ready for me yet. Like Tommy said, I'd been walking these woods for years, but my time hadn't come. Not yet. I made it back to my cruiser as the sun was setting, exhausted and shaken. When I got back to town, I filed a report stating that Tommy Henderson had run away from home and was presumed to have left the county. It was a lie, but it was a lie that let his parents sleep at night. The truth was something else entirely. Over the next few years, more children went missing. Never more than one at a time, never in ways that seemed connected. A girl from the next county over who was visiting relatives. A boy from town who was known to wander. A teenager who'd been having problems at home. Always children who wouldn't be missed immediately, or whose disappearances could be explained in mundane ways. And always, their last known location was somewhere near the woods. I started keeping a map in my office, marking every missing child report with a red pin. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look. They were all being drawn to the same general area, all following the same invisible pull that led to Dead Hollow. But I never went back there. I told myself it was because I was afraid, and that was partly true. But the real reason was something Tommy had said, that my time hadn't come yet. And I was terrified that if I went back, it would be. I retired 5 years ago, passed the badge on to Deputy Mills. He's a good man, and he knows the stories about Dead Hollow, but he's never seen what I've seen. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe some knowledge is too dangerous to pass on. But I still keep the map. Still add new pins when children go missing. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear them calling to me from the woods. Not just Tommy, but all of them. All the lost children, inviting me to come walking. The hollow is patient. It's been collecting for centuries, and it can wait a little longer. But I'm getting old now, and I know that someday, the call will be too strong to resist. Someday, I'll find myself walking those familiar paths one last time, following the trail that leads down into the darkness between the trees. And when that day comes, when I take my place in that circle of lost children, the hollow will finally have what it's been waiting for all along, someone who knows its secret. Someone who can help it reach out beyond the trees and start collecting the rest of the world. But until then, I keep my distance from those woods. I stay in town, where the streetlights keep the shadows at bay and the sound of traffic drowns out the whispers in the wind. Because there's a part of those woods where even the birds won't fly. And God help the poor soul that wanders in. I saw the glint of wet bone in my headlights. And that thing was smiling at me. Now, I've been sheriff of Millbrook for 37 years, and in that time I've seen plenty that would make most folks lose sleep. But this particular case, well, it's the one that made me start sleeping with the lights on. Still do, matter of fact, even though it's been 8 years since it happened. The thing about small towns like ours is that they hold on to their secrets, like graves hold on to bones. Millbrook sits in a valley between two ridges of granite that look like sleeping giants. The town's been there since 1847, and some of the older families, the Weavers, the Crofts, the Blackwoods, they've been there just as long. Their roots go deep, deeper than seems natural for a place where the soil is thin and the bedrock shows through like old scars. It was early October when the reports started coming in. Mrs. Henley from Maple Street called first, her voice thin as paper over the phone. She'd seen a man walking past her house around midnight, she said. Nothing unusual in that, except he wasn't wearing any clothes. And when she looked closer through her bedroom window, squinting through her thick glasses, she realized he wasn't wearing any skin either. I took the report, filed it under what I privately called widow's nightmares, the kind of calls you get from lonely old folks whose minds play tricks on them in the dark hours. But then Tom Breslin called 2 nights later with the same story. Tom was a practical man who'd run the hardware store for 20 years. Not given to flights of fancy or midnight hallucinations. "Sheriff, I know how it sounds," he said, and I could hear him scratching his graying beard through the phone. "But I saw what I saw. Looked like a man who'd been skinned clean, walking down Main Street bold as brass. Left wet footprints on the sidewalk. I went out to check after he passed, and they were still there, soaking into the concrete. That's when I started paying attention. The third call came from Jenny Morse, the night shift nurse at our little clinic. She was driving home around 3 in the morning when she saw him crossing the street near the old cemetery. Her description matched the others perfectly, a figure that moved with human purpose but looked like something that belonged in a medical textbook. Raw muscle and gleaming bone, walking upright under the streetlights like it had every right to be there. The worst part, she told me the next day, her hands shaking as she held her coffee cup, was that it turned and looked at me when I drove past. And Sheriff, I swear it smiled. How does something without lips smile? I started driving the night patrol myself after that. Millbrook after midnight is a different creature than it is during the day. The streetlights cast pools of yellow that seem to push the darkness back rather than illuminate it, and the shadows between them feel alive, breathing. The old Victorian houses on Elm Street creak and sigh like arthritic joints, and the wind through the maples sounds almost like whispers. But that's normal for a town that's seen more than its share of winters and sorrows. What wasn't normal were the wet footprints. I found them on my third night of patrol, a trail of damp impressions leading from the storm drain near the park all the way to the steps of the old Methodist church. They were human-shaped but wrong somehow, too long, the toes splayed wider than they should be. And they were still wet, hours after the last rain. I followed them with my flashlight, the beam dancing nervously in my grip. The prints led right up to the church doors, then stopped. Just ended, like whatever made them had simply vanished into the wood. I tried the doors, expecting them to be locked as they'd been for the past 5 years since Reverend Clayton retired and moved to Phoenix. But the handle turned smooth as silk, and the door swung open with barely a whisper. The inside of the church smelled like old hymnals and something else, something organic and wet, like the bottom of a pond. My footsteps echoed in the empty space, the sound bouncing off the vaulted ceiling and coming back wrong, distorted. The pews sat in neat rows, just as they had for decades, but there was water pooled in the aisle between them. Not much, just enough to catch the light from my flashlight and throw it back in ripples. I followed the water trail to the altar, where it stopped at the base of the wooden cross. The cross itself was dry, but the floor around it was soaked, as if someone had stood there dripping for hours. That's when I heard the breathing. It was soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakably human. The rhythm was wrong, though, too slow, too deep, like someone was trying to remember how to do it. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, sweeping it across the empty pews and the shadows that clung to the walls like cobwebs. Nothing. But the breathing continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I left the church that night with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that whatever was walking through Millbrook wasn't quite as human as it appeared. The next morning brought Dr. Elizabeth Croft to my office. She was one of the old Millbrook Crofts, her family's name carved into headstones throughout the cemetery, and she'd come back to town 3 months earlier to settle her grandmother's estate. She was a forensic pathologist from the State University, which made her the closest thing we had to an expert on the macabre. "Sheriff," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years working with the dead. "I heard about the reports. The figure people have been seeing." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "My grandmother used to tell stories about something similar. Back in the 1920s, there were sightings of what folks called the anatomy man. Always appeared during the autumn months, always left wet footprints, always seen around the church or the cemetery." "What happened to it?" Dr. Croft's pale eyes fixed on mine. "According to the stories, it just disappeared one day. After the Wickham boy went missing." The Wickham boy. I knew that name from the old case files in the basement. Timothy Wickham, age 12, vanished without a trace in October of 1923. The file was thin, just a few pages of reports and witness statements. But what struck me was the timing, right when the sighting stopped. "Dr. Croft," I said, "what would you say if I told you someone had been walking around town with no skin on?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming silently on the arm of her chair. "Medically speaking, it's impossible. The human body can't survive without its skin. It's not just protection, it's a vital organ. Without it, you die from infection, blood loss, temperature regulation failure. You'd last hours at most, maybe minutes. But hypothetically, if something like that existed, It would need to stay constantly moist to prevent the exposed tissue from drying out and dying. It would leave wet footprints wherever it went, because it would be constantly seeping bodily fluids. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't like. That night, I wasn't alone on patrol. Dr. Croft had asked to ride along, bringing with her a bag of equipment that she said might help us understand what we were dealing with. We drove the quiet streets of Millbrook in comfortable silence, both of us watching the shadows between the streetlights. It was just past midnight when we saw him. He stood at the intersection of Main and Oak, directly under the streetlight, as if he wanted to be seen. The light played across his form like water, highlighting the intricate network of muscles and tendons that covered his frame. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and narrow waist of a man in his prime. But where his skin should have been, there was only glistening red tissue, wet and gleaming under the artificial light. His head turned toward our patrol car as we approached, and I saw Dr. Croft's sharp intake of breath beside me. The face was the worst part. All the familiar landmarks were there, the eyes and nose and mouth, but stripped of their covering they looked alien, wrong. The eyes were the worst, white and round and far too knowing. And he was smiling. Without lips, without skin, the thing that had once been a man was showing its teeth in a grotesque parody of human expression. I stopped the car 20 feet away, my hand instinctively moving to the service weapon at my hip. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching us with those impossible eyes. "My God!" Dr. Croft whispered. "It's real." The thing raised one hand, a skeletal framework wrapped in raw muscle, and waved. A slow, deliberate gesture that was somehow more terrifying than any aggressive move could have been. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness between two houses like it had never been there at all. But the wet footprints remained. Dr. Croft was out of the car before I could stop her, kneeling beside the nearest print with a small vial and a pair of tweezers. She collected a sample of the fluid, holding it up to the streetlight with scientific fascination. "It's not water," she said. "It's thicker. More viscous." We followed the trail of prints through backyards and between houses, past the old cemetery and down toward the industrial district near the river. The prints led us to a building I hadn't thought about in years, the old Millbrook Anatomy School. It had been closed since the 1940s, when the medical college in the state capital expanded and drew away all the students. The building had sat empty ever since, too isolated and specialized to be useful for anything else. 3 stories of red brick and tall windows, with a basement that had once housed the cadaver storage and preparation rooms. The wet footprints led right to the front door. "Sheriff," Dr. Croft said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and professional curiosity. "I think we need to go inside." The door was unlocked, just like the church had been. It swung open with a groan that seemed to echo from the building's bones, and we stepped into a darkness that felt thick enough to swim through. Our flashlights revealed the lobby that time had forgotten. Dust covered everything like a shroud, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains. But cutting through the dust were wet footprints, leading deeper into the building. We followed them past empty classrooms with anatomical charts still hanging on the walls, past laboratories with equipment that belonged in a museum. The prints led us to a staircase that descended into the basement, and I could smell something rising from below, that same organic, pond water smell I'd encountered in the church. The basement was a maze of small rooms connected by narrow corridors. Storage rooms, preparation rooms, a small library filled with medical texts that nobody had touched in decades. But at the center of it all was a large room that must have been the main laboratory, with tall tables and bright lights and sinks designed for purposes I didn't want to think about. And in the middle of the room, lying on one of the tables, was a body. It was covered by a sheet that had once been white but was now stained with decades of moisture and neglect. The shape underneath was unmistakably human, and as we approached, I could see that the sheet was wet, soaked through with the same fluid we'd been following all night. Dr. Croft reached for the corner of the sheet with hands that were steadier than mine would have been. "Don't," I said, but she was already pulling it back. What lay beneath was a man in his 30s, perfectly preserved despite the obvious age of his surroundings. His skin was pale but intact, unmarked by decay or injury. He looked like he might have been sleeping, if not for the fact that his chest wasn't moving. "This is impossible," Dr. Croft whispered. "The preservation is perfect. No decomposition, no insect activity, no signs of chemical treatment." I looked closer and saw something that made my stomach clench. Pinned to the man's shirt was a small brass nameplate. T. Wickham, Anatomy, Subject 1923. Timothy Wickham. The missing boy from 1923, except he was no longer 12 years old. Somehow, impossibly, he had aged while lying dead on this table for 80 years. "Dr. Croft," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we need to leave. Now." But she was already examining the body, her scientific training overriding her common sense. "Sheriff, look at this. The skin shows no signs of removal, but there are these marks." She pointed to thin lines that ran along the body's arms and legs, barely visible against the pale skin. They looked like surgical incisions, precisely made and perfectly healed. "It's like someone practiced removing the skin without actually doing it," she said. "Mapped out the process." That's when we heard the footsteps above us. Slow, deliberate, wet. Something was walking through the building above our heads, its feet making that distinctive squelching sound we'd been following all night. I drew my weapon, though I had no idea what good it would do against something that shouldn't exist. The footsteps continued their circuit overhead, moving from room to room like they were searching for something. Or someone. Dr. Croft had gone pale, her scientific detachment finally cracking. "Sheriff, what if the thing we saw isn't something that lost its skin? What if it's something that's trying to find it?" The footsteps stopped directly above us. Then, slowly, they began to descend the stairs. I grabbed Dr. Croft's arm and pulled her toward a door at the far end of the laboratory. It led to another corridor, this one ending in a set of stairs that I hoped would take us up to a different part of the building. Behind us, the footsteps reached the basement and began moving through the maze of rooms, getting closer with each wet, deliberate step. We reached the stairs and climbed as quietly as we could, our flashlights bouncing wild shadows on the walls. The stairs led to a side exit, and we stumbled out into the October night like refugees from a nightmare. But as we reached the patrol car, I looked back at the building and saw a figure silhouetted in one of the third-story windows. It raised its hand again in that same deliberate wave, and even from that distance, I could see the gleam of wet bone in the moonlight. We drove back to town in silence, both of us trying to process what we'd seen. It wasn't until we reached the station that Dr. Croft spoke again. "Sheriff," she said, "I've been thinking about what we saw down there. The body, the preservation, the surgical marks." I waited for her to continue. "What if the anatomy school never really closed? What if someone's been using it all these years, practicing, perfecting techniques that shouldn't be possible?" "What kind of techniques?" "The kind that would let you remove someone's skin and keep them alive. The kind that would let you preserve a body indefinitely while it continues to age. The kind that would create exactly what we saw tonight." I thought about the wet footprints, the impossible figure walking through our town, the body lying in that basement laboratory. "Dr. Croft," I said, "I think we need to contact the state police." But when I tried to call the state police the next morning, I discovered that all the phone lines out of Millbrook were down. Not damaged by weather or accident, just silent, as if the town had been quietly disconnected from the outside world. The roadblocks came next. Not physical barriers, but accidents and construction projects that seemed to spring up overnight on every route leading out of town. Tree down across Highway 9. Gas leak on Route 23 requiring a detour that somehow led back to Millbrook. Bridge out on County Road 15. It was Dr. Croft who first voiced what we were both thinking. "We're not supposed to leave, are we?" The sightings increased after that. Not just the skinless figure, but others. Men and women in various states of anatomical display, walking through Millbrook like it was the most natural thing in the world. Some were missing only their skin, others were more extensively modified, showing their internal workings like living medical textbooks. And always they were wet, leaving trails of moisture wherever they went. The townspeople stopped calling in reports. Not because the sightings stopped, but because they were becoming too common to mention. Mrs. Henley started leaving bowls of water on her porch, like she was feeding stray cats. Tom Breslin began mopping the wet footprints from his store's sidewalk without complaint. Jenny Morse started taking different routes home from the clinic, not to avoid the figures but to give them space. Millbrook was adapting, accepting its new residents with the same quiet resignation it had shown for everything else over the past century and a half. I kept patrolling, kept investigating, kept trying to understand what was happening to my town. But as the days passed, I began to notice changes in myself. Small things at first, a heightened awareness of my own skin, a fascination with the way light played across the surface of water, an urge to touch the wet footprints when I found them. Dr. Croft was experiencing similar changes. She'd started spending more time at the anatomy school, despite my warnings. She claimed she was researching, trying to understand the process, but I could see something else in her eyes. The same thing I was beginning to feel. Curiosity. About what it would be like to shed the constraints of skin and bone, to walk through the world as something more honest, more real. The old families, the Weavers, the Crofts, the Blackwoods, they knew, of course. They'd always known. This wasn't the first time Millbrook had hosted these visitors. It happened every few decades, when the conditions were right and the barriers between what was and what could be grew thin. Mrs. Blackwood explained it to me one evening as I sat on her porch, watching the wet footprints multiply on her front walk. "They're not monsters, Sheriff," she said in her paper-thin voice. "They're just people who chose a different way of being. The anatomy school, it wasn't really a school, you understand. It was more like a sanctuary. A place where folks could explore the possibilities of human form. But Timothy Wickham was just a boy. Timothy Wickham was curious. Same as you are now. Same as Dr. Croft. The town provides what's needed, when it's needed." I wanted to argue with her, to maintain my grip on rational thought and conventional reality. But as I sat there watching the skinless figures move through the growing darkness, I felt that grip loosening. The final night came 3 weeks after it all began. I was patrolling alone. Dr. Croft had disappeared 2 days earlier, and I suspected I knew where she'd gone when I saw the procession. They were walking down Main Street in a loose group, perhaps 20 of them, all in various states of anatomical display. Some I recognized as townspeople who'd gone missing over the years. Others were strangers, drawn to Millbrook by whatever force had created this place of transformation. At the head of the procession was the first figure I'd seen, the one who'd smiled at me with his lipless mouth. But now I could see that his expression wasn't grotesque or threatening. It was welcoming. They stopped in front of the patrol car, and the leader approached my window. This close, I could see every detail of his exposed musculature, every fiber and tendon working in perfect harmony. He was beautiful in his way, honest and unashamed. He tapped on the glass with one finger, a gentle, almost polite gesture. I rolled down the window. "Sheriff," he said, and his voice was wet but clear, like words spoken through water. "We've been waiting for you." "Waiting for what?" "For you to understand. For you to see what we see. The town chooses its guardians carefully." I looked past him at the others, and I saw Dr. Croft among them. She'd undergone the transformation, her skin gone but her eyes bright with scientific wonder. She waved at me, and I could see the precise mapping of muscles that had once been hidden beneath her pale skin. "It doesn't hurt," the leader said, following my gaze. "The opposite, actually. It's liberation. Freedom from the constraints of conventional flesh." I felt the pull then, stronger than ever. The urge to join them, to shed the boundaries that separated me from the truth of human anatomy. But something held me back. Duty, perhaps, or simple stubborn humanity. "I can't," I said. The leader nodded, unsurprised. "Not yet. But someday. When you're ready." The procession moved on, heading toward the anatomy school where they would spend the daylight hours before emerging again to walk the streets of Millbrook. I watched them go, and I felt something shift inside me, a door opening that I wasn't sure I could close again. That was 8 years ago. The sightings continue, though less frequently now. Millbrook has settled into its new rhythm, accepting its nocturnal residents as part of the natural order. The phone lines work again, the roads have reopened, but somehow people don't seem inclined to leave. Dr. Croft visits me sometimes, usually on the nights when the autumn air grows thin. She's gotten used to her new form, learned to move gracefully without the weight of skin. She brings me updates from the anatomy school, tells me about the research they're conducting there, the boundaries they're pushing. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the station, I find myself thinking about that first moment, seeing the glint of wet bone in my headlights, that impossible smile. I think about liberation, about truth, about the courage it takes to shed everything that makes you conventionally human. I'm getting older now, my skin growing thin and fragile with age. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what it would be like to let it go entirely, to join the others in their honest exploration of what it means to be human. The wet footprints still appear on my porch sometimes, leading from my front door toward the center of town. They're patient, those footprints. They can wait. And I think someday soon, I might follow them. After all, every sheriff needs to know his town completely. Even the parts that walk without skin. Sheriff Paranormal Files Case Number 247 Status: Open. I've seen death plenty. But nothing prepared me for what I heard under that lid. 37 years wearing this badge in Millhaven, and I thought I'd catalogued every variety of human misery this town could produce. Domestic disputes that ended with blood on kitchen linoleum. Teenagers wrapped around telephone poles on prom night. Old Mrs. Henderson who died alone and wasn't found until her cats had been without food for a week. Death becomes routine when you're the law in a place where nothing much happens except dying. But this wasn't routine. This was something else entirely. The call came in Tuesday morning, October 3rd. Not a frantic midnight summons or a whispered emergency, just Harold Cutler's voice, steady as always, asking if I could swing by the funeral home when I had a minute. Harold owned Cutler and Sons, though there hadn't been any sons involved in the business for going on 20 years. His boy Danny had lit out for Portland after high school, and the other one, well, we don't talk about the other one. Harold's voice carried that particular weight that comes with handling the dead for 4 decades. Nothing rattled him. I'd seen him prepare bodies that had been in car wrecks so bad the paramedics lost their breakfast, and Harold would just hum old hymns while he worked, hands steady as a surgeon's. So when Harold Cutler asks you to stop by because something's not quite right, you pay attention. I found him in the preparation room, standing beside a mahogany casket that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The smell hit me first, not the usual funeral home cocktail of formaldehyde and flowers, but something underneath. Something organic and wrong, like milk that had turned but hadn't quite soured enough to throw away. "Sheriff," Harold said, not looking up from the casket. "Appreciate you coming." The deceased was Eleanor Marsh, 93 years old, died peacefully in her sleep according to her grandson who found her. Natural causes. Doc Peterson had signed the certificate without hesitation. I'd known Eleanor since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. She used to run the library before it closed down in '98. Sweet old bird who made cookies for the volunteer fire department every Christmas. "What seems to be the trouble, Harold?" He ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture I'd never seen from him before. Harold didn't fidget. Harold didn't show uncertainty. But now he looked like a man who'd been wrestling with something that didn't fit into his neat, orderly world. "Started Sunday night," he said. "After I finished with Mrs. Marsh, got her all prepared and situated. I was locking up, doing my final walkthrough, when I heard." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Scratching. From inside the casket." I studied his face. Harold Cutler had embalmed half the county over the past 40 years. He wasn't the type to let his imagination run wild. Could have been settling. Would adjusting to temperature changes. That's what I told myself. He nodded toward the casket. But it happened again Monday night. Same time, right around 11:30. Not settling, Sheriff. Deliberate. Like fingernails on wood. The fluorescent light above us flickered once, casting momentary shadows across Eleanor's peaceful face. Her hands were folded over her chest, the same way Harold had positioned countless others. But there was something about her fingers that bothered me, not their position, but their condition. The nails looked fresh, recently grown, though that was impossible. "You open it up?" "No, sir. Couldn't bring myself to." Harold's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I listened. Pressed my ear right against the wood. And Sheriff, I swear I could hear breathing in there. The preparation room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in with their pale green paint and medical charts showing proper embalming procedures. Outside, Millhaven carried on with its Tuesday morning routine. Coffee brewing at Mabel's diner, school buses rumbling down Elm Street, dogs barking at invisible threats. But in here something had shifted off its axis. "Harold, you know as well as I do that bodies can make sounds. Gases releasing, muscles contracting. This wasn't gas." His interruption was sharp, uncharacteristic. This was purposeful. "And Sheriff, there's something else. Look at her hands." I leaned closer, squinting at Eleanor's folded hands. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. But as I studied them more carefully, I noticed what Harold had seen. Her fingernails weren't just fresh, they were longer than they should be. And under several of them, barely visible, were what looked like wood shavings. "When did you last trim her nails?" "Sunday evening, before I closed her up. Cut them neat and clean, same as always." Harold's voice had taken on a hollow quality. "Sheriff, I've been in this business longer than I care to count. I've seen bodies do strange things, and I've learned to accept the science behind it. But this," he gestured helplessly at the casket, "this doesn't have any science." I walked around the casket, examining it from all angles. The mahogany was pristine, no scratches or marks on the exterior. But when I knelt down and looked closer at the seam where the lid met the base, I could see tiny wood particles scattered on the floor. Fresh ones. You hear it every night? Sunday and Monday. Both times around 11:30. I was hoping maybe it would stop, but... Harold glanced at the wall clock. It was just past 9 in the morning. I can't keep her here much longer. Service is scheduled for Thursday. Mrs. Marsh's grandson is driving up from Boston, and I can't very well tell him his grandmother is restless. The word hung in the air between us like smoke. Restless. Such a small word to describe something so fundamentally wrong with the natural order of things. I'd grown up in Millhaven, born and raised on stories that went back to when the town was first settled in 1847. Old-timers used to talk about the ground here, how it was different somehow. Native Americans had avoided this particular valley, they said, called it the place where the earth sleeps badly. Most folks dismissed it as folklore, the kind of tales small towns tell to make themselves feel more interesting than they really are. But standing in Harold's preparation room, looking down at Eleanor Marsh's two long fingernails, I found myself remembering those stories with uncomfortable clarity. I'll stay tonight, I heard myself saying. Keep watch. See what we're dealing with. Harold's relief was visible, his shoulders dropping as if he'd been carrying a weight for days. I'd appreciate that, Sheriff. More than you know. The rest of the day passed with the mundane rhythm of small-town law enforcement. A fender bender on Main Street, paperwork that needed filing, a call about teenagers smoking behind the pharmacy that turned out to be steam from the new pizza oven. Normal things. Predictable things. The kind of routine that makes you forget there are mysteries in the world that can't be solved with handcuffs and citations. But as evening approached, I found my thoughts drifting back to the funeral home. To Eleanor Marsh lying in her mahogany box, her fingernails growing in death, her hands scratching at wood that should have remained untouched until Thursday's service. I drove home as the sun was setting, painting Millhaven in shades of amber and rust. The town looked peaceful from my kitchen window, neat houses with well-tended lawns, the Methodist church steeple rising above the maple trees, children playing in the park before their mothers called them in for supper. It was a postcard picture of American small-town life, the kind of place where the worst crime is usually teenagers tipping over tombstones on Halloween. But every place has its shadows, and Millhaven's ran deeper than most people wanted to acknowledge. The Henderson place out on County Road 7, where 3 generations of the family had died by suicide. The old Brewster mine shaft that had been sealed since 1962 after a cave-in that killed 6 men, sealed, but not forgotten, and certainly not quiet. Locals avoided it, claimed they could still hear hammering echoing up from the depths on certain nights when the wind was still. And then there was the cemetery itself. Millhaven Memorial, established the same year as the town, where nearly 2 centuries of residence lay beneath weathered headstones and slowly sinking grave markers. The cemetery where Eleanor Marsh was scheduled to be buried Thursday afternoon, assuming we could figure out what was happening in Harold's preparation room. I ate a quick dinner, leftover pot roast that had seen better days, and tried to focus on television, but my mind kept wandering. Finally, around 10 o'clock, I gave up pretending normalcy was possible and drove back to the funeral home. Harold was waiting for me in the lobby, looking older than his 68 years. He'd changed into a fresh suit, as if preparing for an important occasion, but his hands shook slightly as he poured coffee from a thermos. Any more incidents today? Quiet as a tomb, he said, then winced at his own words. Sorry. Occupational hazard. We settled into chairs facing the preparation room door. Harold had left it slightly ajar, and I could see the edge of Eleanor's casket through the gap. The fluorescent lights had been dimmed to a soft glow, casting everything in an ethereal, underwater quality. Tell me about the family, I said. Eleanor's people. Any history I should know about? Harold considered this, sipping his coffee slowly. Eleanor was a Brennan before she married Walter Marsh. The Brennans went back to the town's founding, one of the original settler families. Her great-great-grandfather was Thomas Brennan, helped survey the original town plots. I knew the name from local history. Thomas Brennan had been instrumental in Millhaven's early development, but he'd also been involved in some of the darker chapters of the town's past. There had been issues with the Native American tribes who'd originally used this valley, disputes that had ended badly for all concerned. Eleanor ever mention anything unusual about her family? Any stories passed down? Not to me directly, but... Harold set down his coffee cup, the china clinking softly in the quiet room. I remember my father talking about the Brennans when I was young. Said they were touched by something. Lived longer than they should have, died harder than most. My father prepared 3 generations of Brennans, and he always said their bodies were different somehow. Took longer for the rigor mortis to set in, stayed warmer than they should have. The wall clock ticked toward 11:30. Outside, Millhaven had settled into its nightly quiet, the kind of deep silence that only comes to small towns after the last porch light goes out and the last television flickers off. But inside the funeral home, I could feel something building, a tension that made the air itself seem thicker. At 11:28, the scratching began. It started soft, almost tentative, like someone testing the strength of a locked door. But it was definitely coming from inside Eleanor's casket, a rhythmic scraping that sent chills down my spine despite my years of experience with the worst humanity had to offer. Harold and I exchanged glances, and I saw my own unease reflected in his eyes. Without speaking, we both stood and moved closer to the preparation room door. The scratching grew more insistent, more desperate. Not random scrabbling, but deliberate patterns, as if Eleanor were trying to communicate something. Long scratches followed by short ones, pauses, then repetition. It almost sounded like Morse code, Harold whispered. I listened more carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was right. The pattern was too regular, too structured to be random. Long scratch, short scratch, long scratch. 3 short scratches. 3 long scratches. SOS. The universal distress signal, being tapped out from inside a sealed casket by a woman who had been dead for 3 days. We stood frozen in the doorway, listening to Eleanor Marsh's desperate plea for help echoing through the funeral home. The sound seemed to fill the entire building, bouncing off the walls and ceiling until it felt like we were standing inside a giant echo chamber. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. It pressed against our eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigeration unit and our own labored breathing. "We have to open it," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Harold nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Together, we approached the casket. Up close, I could see new scratches on the inside of the lid, visible through the gap between the upper and lower halves. The mahogany was scored with deep gouges that formed letters, words I could barely make out in the dim light. "Help me. Not dead. Trapped." Harold's hands shook as he reached for the lid release, but he managed to unlatch the mechanism. The casket opened with a soft sigh, like air escaping from a sealed tomb. Eleanor Marsh lay exactly as Harold had positioned her Sunday evening. Her hands were still folded over her chest, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a 93-year-old woman who had died quietly in her sleep. Except for her fingernails, which were now visibly longer, stained with blood and wood pulp. And except for her eyes, which opened as soon as the lid lifted and fixed on mine with an intelligence that should have been impossible. Sheriff, she said, her voice a dry whisper that sounded like autumn leaves scraping across concrete. Thank you for coming. I've been a law enforcement officer for nearly 4 decades. I've seen murders and suicides, drug overdoses and domestic violence, car wrecks that painted the highway red. I've dealt with drunks and addicts, wife beaters and child molesters, every variety of human depravity and weakness. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for the moment when a dead woman opened her eyes and thanked me for releasing her from her coffin. Harold made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, stumbling backward until he hit the wall. But I found myself leaning closer, drawn by a combination of horror and fascination that I couldn't explain. Eleanor? Can you hear me? Her eyes tracked to my face, focusing with obvious effort. I can hear everything, Sheriff. Every whisper, every footstep, every prayer said over my body. I've been aware since the moment everyone thought I died. But you did die. Doc Peterson confirmed it. No heartbeat, no breathing. The body died, she agreed, her voice gaining strength. But I didn't. Not completely. Something held me here, kept me tethered to this flesh even after it stopped working properly. I glanced at Harold, who had pressed himself against the wall as if trying to merge with it. His face was pale as paper, but he was listening to every word. What held you? Eleanor's lips curved into what might have been a smile if it hadn't been so unsettling. The same thing that's held every Brennan who's ever died in this town, Sheriff. The same thing that's been waiting in the ground of Millhaven Memorial for more than a century and a half. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I could see my breath misting in the air, though the funeral home's heating system was working perfectly. What are you talking about? My great-great-grandfather made a bargain when he helped found this town, Eleanor said, struggling to sit up in the casket. I wanted to help her but couldn't bring myself to touch her cold flesh. The Native Americans tried to warn him, told him this valley was cursed, that the earth itself was hungry. But Thomas Brennan was a practical man who didn't believe in curses or hungry earth. She paused, breathing laboriously, though I wasn't sure why she needed to breathe at all. The tribe had been keeping something contained here, Sheriff. Something old and patient and very, very hungry. When Thomas Brennan drove them off and established the town, he broke the containment. And the thing in the earth, it offered him a deal. What kind of deal? Prosperity for his family, long life, success in all endeavors. All it asked in return was that when we died, we didn't really die. We became part of it, fed it, strengthened it. Generation after generation, the Brennans have been nourishing whatever sleeps beneath Millhaven Memorial. Harold found his voice, though it came out as a croak. That's impossible. Just folklore and superstition. Eleanor turned her attention to him, and I saw Harold flinch at the intensity of her gaze. Is it Harold? Your father prepared my grandmother, my mother, my Aunt Sarah. Did he ever tell you how they fought the embalming process? How their bodies seemed to resist preservation, as if something inside them was still actively alive? Harold's silence was answer enough. Every Brennan buried in that cemetery is still conscious, Sheriff. Still aware. We feed the thing below with our eternal suffering, and in return, our family prospered above ground. Until now. What's different now? I'm the last. Eleanor's voice carried a weight of infinite sadness. The family line ends with me. No children, no grandchildren, no one left to carry on the bargain. And the thing below, it's getting restless. It's been feeding on Brennan consciousness for over a century, but that food source is about to end. The implications of what she was saying began to sink in, and I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. What happens when the bargain ends? It looks for new sources of nourishment. Eleanor said simply. It's already started. Haven't you noticed, Sheriff? The way this town has been changing over the past few years? More suicides, more accidents, more people dying in their sleep? It's testing the waters, so to speak. Sampling the local population. I thought about the Henderson family, 3 generations of suicides. The uptick in unusual deaths over the past few years that I'd attributed to coincidence, and the natural aging of the population. The growing sense of unease that seemed to permeate Millhaven like fog, making people anxious and depressed without obvious cause. What does it want from me? Help, Eleanor said. I can break the bargain, Sheriff, but I need to be buried properly. Not in Millhaven Memorial, but in consecrated ground that hasn't been tainted by what lies below. The old Methodist cemetery outside town, where the original minister is buried. If you can get me there, if you can see me properly laid to rest, the Brennan line ends cleanly. The bargain dies with me. And if I don't? Eleanor's expression grew grim. Then it takes the whole town. Every man, woman, and child in Millhaven becomes part of its eternal feast. And believe me, Sheriff, you don't want to experience eternity as food for something that hungers but never dies. I looked at Harold, who was staring at Eleanor with a mixture of terror and fascination. You believe this? I don't know what I believe anymore, he admitted. But I do know that in 40 years of preparing bodies, I've never seen anything like what's happening here. And I've heard the stories about the Brennans, the whispers that have been passed down through generations of funeral directors in this town. The wall clock chimed midnight, and with the sound, Eleanor suddenly stiffened in the casket. Her eyes rolled back, showing only white, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was deeper now, layered with harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere far below the funeral home. Too late, she said, though the voice wasn't hers anymore. The bargain cannot be broken. What was given cannot be taken back. What was promised will be delivered. The lights in the preparation room began to flicker, and I could hear something moving beneath the floor, not the scurrying of mice or the settling of old timbers, but something large and deliberate, as if the building's foundation was shifting. Eleanor's body convulsed once, violently, and then she was still. But her eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling with an expression of absolute terror. Eleanor? I reached out tentatively, touched her hand. Her flesh was ice cold and completely rigid. She's gone, Harold whispered. Really gone this time. But as he spoke, we heard something that made both of us freeze. From somewhere deep beneath the funeral home came a sound like breathing, slow, rhythmic, and impossibly vast. As if something the size of a city block was drawing air into its lungs. The breathing grew louder, more pronounced, and with each inhalation, the building shook slightly. Dust fell from the ceiling tiles, and I could hear the casket's metal fittings rattling. We need to get out of here, I said, grabbing Harold's arm. But as we turned toward the door, we found our path blocked. Eleanor Marsh was standing in the doorway, though I had just seen her lying motionless in the casket. She looked exactly as she had in life, elderly but sturdy, wearing the blue dress Harold had chosen for her burial. Except for her eyes, which were completely black, and her mouth, which was open far wider than any human mouth should be able to open. The bargain stands, she said, and her voice was the sound of earth falling on coffin lids. The feast continues. The town feeds the hunger below. Behind her, I could see other figures moving in the funeral home's lobby. Shadowy forms that might have been people, if people could exist without casting reflections in the mirrors that lined the walls. Harold grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave bruises. The back door, he hissed. We ran through the preparation room, past the empty casket, toward the rear exit that Harold used for deliveries. But as we reached the door, we could hear something scratching at it from the outside. The same deliberate scratching we'd heard from Eleanor's coffin, but multiplied 100-fold. The breathing beneath the building was getting louder, more insistent, and now I could feel it through the soles of my feet. The entire funeral home was pulsing in rhythm with whatever lay below, as if the building itself had become part of some vast, underground circulatory system. "The embalming fluid," Harold said suddenly. "In the storage room. It's flammable." I understood immediately. If we couldn't escape, we could at least deny the thing below what it wanted. Fire had always been humanity's answer to the things that shouldn't exist. We fought our way back through the preparation room, where Eleanor's empty casket had begun to rock back and forth on its stand. The lid was slamming open and shut like a mouth trying to speak, and with each slam, I could hear words forming. "Feed us, feed us, feed us." The storage room was at the back of the funeral home, a cramped space filled with chemicals and supplies. Harold fumbled for the lights, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the switch. When the fluorescence finally flickered to life, we could see gallon jugs of embalming fluid lined up on metal shelves like chemical soldiers. "This should do it," Harold said, grabbing one of the jugs. "But Sheriff, if we do this, the whole building goes up," I finished. "I know." Outside the storage room, we could hear footsteps, slow, measured, and definitely not made by the living. Eleanor's voice called to us, sweet as honey and twice as thick. "Come out, Sheriff." "Harold, there's no need for drama. The transition will be painless. You'll understand once you're part of the greater hunger." Harold looked at me with desperate eyes. "My life's work is in this building. 40 years of serving families, helping them say goodbye to their loved ones. And it's been good work," I said. "But this isn't about the building anymore. It's about the town. All those families you've served over the years, their children and grandchildren are still out there, sleeping in their beds, trusting us to keep them safe." Harold nodded, understanding. He opened the first jug and began pouring embalming fluid across the floor. The chemical smell was overwhelming in the confined space, making my eyes water. But it also seemed to have an effect on whatever was moving through the funeral home. The footsteps stopped, and Eleanor's voice took on a note of alarm. "What are you doing in there?" "Creating a little light," I called back, pulling out my cigarette lighter. I'd been trying to quit smoking for 20 years, but for once I was grateful for the habit. The flame caught the fumes before it reached the liquid, creating a blue wave of fire that raced across the storage room floor. Harold and I had just enough time to duck behind a metal cabinet before the first explosion shook the building. The embalming fluid burned with a chemical intensity that turned the storage room into a furnace. But even over the roar of the flames, I could hear something else, a sound like screaming, but not quite human. It came from below the building, from whatever had been feeding on Brennan consciousness for over a century. "It's working!" Harold shouted over the noise. "Listen to it!" The screaming grew louder, more desperate, and with it came a sound like the earth itself cracking open. Through the smoke and fire, I could see the floor of the funeral home beginning to buckle and split, revealing darkness beneath. But the darkness wasn't empty. Things were moving down there, pale shapes that might once have been human but had been changed by decades of service to the hunger below. I could see faces I recognized, longtime Millhaven residents who had died over the years, people I'd known and respected, now serving as sustenance for something that should never have been allowed to exist. The fire was spreading now, consuming the funeral home with supernatural speed. The building's sprinkler system activated, but the water seemed to feed the flames rather than extinguish them. We had to get out before the roof collapsed. Harold grabbed my arm, pulling me toward what remained of the back door. The scratching had stopped, and when we reached the exit, we found it clear. Whatever had been trying to get in had apparently decided to deal with the more immediate threat of the fire. We stumbled out into the cool October night, gasping clean air and watching Harold's life's work burn to the ground. But as the flames reached higher, consuming the funeral home's second story, the screaming from below began to fade. Whatever had been trapped beneath the building was finally being forced back to wherever it had come from. The volunteer fire department arrived within 10 minutes, but there was nothing they could do except contain the blaze and keep it from spreading to neighboring buildings. By dawn, nothing remained of Cutler and Sons but a smoking foundation and a hole in the ground that seemed to go down much deeper than any basement should. Harold and I told the fire marshal that we'd been checking on a gas leak when the explosion occurred. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been dangerous vapors in the building, just not the kind that usually cause fires. The investigation concluded that aging pipes and chemical storage had created a perfect storm of circumstances. No one questioned our story too closely, partly because Harold was a respected member of the community, and partly because Millhaven was the kind of town where people preferred simple explanations to complicated truths. Eleanor Marsh was never buried. Her body was consumed in the fire along with the funeral home, which seemed appropriate given what she told us about the need to break the Brennan family's bargain with the thing below. Without her physical remains to anchor it to this world, whatever had been feeding on Brennan consciousness for over a century was finally severed from its food source. The changes in Millhaven were subtle but noticeable. The suicide rate dropped to 0 almost immediately. People started sleeping better, smiling more, taking better care of their properties. The persistent sense of unease that had been growing stronger over the past few years simply evaporated, like fog burning off in morning sunlight. Harold retired after the fire, sold his land to the county, and moved to Florida to live with his surviving son. Before he left, he gave me a box of old records from the funeral home, documents that had been stored in a fireproof safe in his office. Among them were preparation notes going back to his father's time, detailing the unusual characteristics of every Brennan family member who had been embalmed at Cutler and Sons. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Every Brennan had taken longer to die than they should have, fought the embalming process, remained conscious longer than was medically possible. Harold's father had documented it all, along with his growing suspicions about what was really happening in Millhaven Memorial Cemetery. I kept those records in my desk for 3 years, until the day I decided to retire myself. On my last day as sheriff, I drove out to the ruins of the funeral home and threw the box into the hole that had never been properly filled in. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, some truths too terrible to pass on to the next generation. But I still drive by Millhaven Memorial Cemetery sometimes, just to check. The headstones stand in neat rows, weathered by time and marked with familiar names. The Brennan section is in the far corner, where 4 generations of the family lie beneath granite markers that are already starting to sink into the earth. At night, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, you can sometimes hear things moving beneath the grass. Not the frantic scratching of someone trying to escape, but something deeper and more patient. Something that remembers the taste of human consciousness and waits for another opportunity to feed. The bargain may be broken, but some hungers never truly die. They just sleep and dream and wait for the next fool who thinks he can make a deal with the darkness and come out ahead. I've seen death plenty, in all its forms and variations. But now I know there are worse things than dying. There's being trapped between life and death, conscious but powerless, feeding something that should never have been allowed to exist. That's why I'm telling you this story, putting it on record for whoever might need to know. Millhaven looks peaceful now, prosperous and safe, the kind of place where young families want to raise their children. But the earth here remembers what it tasted, and memory has a way of becoming hunger again. If you ever find yourself in a small town where the cemetery is older than it should be, where the funeral director has stories he won't tell and records he won't share, where people live a little too long and die a little too hard, well, maybe it's time to move on to the next town. Some places are better left alone, and some bargains are too dangerous to honor, even in death. End of recording. I shouldn't be taking that turn. Every mile I drove, the blood got thicker. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, the way these things ought to be told. It was August of '98, one of those summers when the heat sits on a place like a wet blanket, pressing down until even the cicadas sound tired. I'd been sheriff of Millbrook County for going on 23 years by then, and I thought I'd seen everything a small town could throw at a man. Domestic disputes that turned deadly, meth labs hidden in tobacco barns, teenagers who went missing and turned up 3 counties over with needle tracks between their toes. The usual small-town rot that festers in places where hope goes to die. Millbrook's one of those towns that never quite recovered from whatever it was supposed to recover from. The textile mill closed in '74, the railroad stopped coming through in '81, and by the time I'm telling you about, we were down to maybe 800 souls, most of them too old or too poor to leave. The kind of place where the Walmart's an hour drive and the local paper comes out twice a week if the editor's feeling ambitious. The town sits in a valley between 2 ridges of hills that look blue in the distance but turn brown and scrubby once you get close. Old-timers used to say the Cherokee called this place where the earth bleeds, though I never put much stock in that kind of talk. Every town's got its stories about what the Indians supposedly said or did, usually made up by somebody's grandfather who read too many dime novels. But I'll tell you what wasn't made up: the accidents. We'd been having them for years, always during the bad storms that rolled through in late summer. Cars would be found wrapped around trees on roads that hadn't existed the day before, or buried nose-deep in ravines that the county surveyors swore weren't on any of their maps. The state boys would come down from the Capitol, take their measurements and their photographs, write up their reports about driver error and poor visibility, and head back north. Case closed, file it under. Act of God. The problem was, I knew these roads. I'd been patrolling them since I was 25 years old, first as a deputy under Sheriff Hawkins, then on my own after the cancer took him. I knew every curve, every pothole, every place where the asphalt buckled in the heat. And I knew, sure as I knew my own name, that some of these accidents were happening on roads that weren't there. The first time I noticed it was after Hurricane Fran came through in September of '96. A traveling salesman from Charlotte, fellow named Morrison, drove his Buick head-on into a pine tree on what his insurance company called County Road 847. Only trouble was, County Road 847 was a dirt track that dead-ended at the old Carmichael place, and it hadn't seen a car in 15 years. I drove out there myself the next morning, following the tire tracks the state police had photographed. They led off the main highway at a place where I'd never seen so much as a deer path, wound through a quarter-mile of woods, and ended at that pine tree with Morrison's blood still dark on the bark. But here's the thing that kept me awake for the next 3 nights. When I went back 2 days later to take another look, the road was gone. Not grown over, not washed out by rain. Gone. Like it had never been there at all. Just forest, thick and green and old, with trees that looked like they'd been growing in that spot since before my grandfather was born. I asked around, casual-like. Old-timers who'd lived in the county their whole lives just shook their heads. No road there, never had been. Must have been mistaken about where the accident happened. Easy thing to do in the woods, especially after a storm. But I wasn't mistaken. I'd stood on that road, felt the asphalt solid under my boots, followed it with my own eyes from the highway to that pine tree with Morrison's brains splattered across its trunk. The second incident was in July of '97. A family from Florida, heading up to visit relatives in Virginia, took what they said was a detour to avoid construction on I-95. Highway Patrol found their minivan at the bottom of a ravine off what the GPS unit called Highway 284, about 10 miles east of town. All 4 of them dead, including 2 kids who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. I knew there was no Highway 284 in Nobuck County. Hell, our highest numbered road was County Road 67, and that was just a gravel track that led to the old quarry. But when I drove out to the scene, there it was, a perfectly paved 2-lane highway with fresh yellow lines and mile markers numbered in sequence. Mile 14, Mile 15, Mile 16, each one standing straight and clean like they'd been installed yesterday. That's when I first noticed the handprints. They were on mile marker 16, about 3 feet up from the base. Small handprints, like a child's, pressed into the white paint while it was still wet. Only the paint wasn't white anymore. It was dark, rust-colored, and when I leaned close to get a better look, I caught a smell that made my stomach turn. Metallic and sweet, like pennies left in your mouth too long. Blood. Fresh blood, even though the accident had happened 2 days before. I called the state crime lab, told them I'd found evidence that might be related to the crash. They sent a technician down, a young fellow with thick glasses and a know-it-all attitude who took scrapings and photographs and generally made me feel like I was wasting his time. 2 weeks later, I got a report that said the samples were inconclusive and contained trace elements consistent with iron oxide, which was their fancy way of saying rust. But I knew what I'd smelled, and I knew what I'd seen. The handprints were gone when I went back the next day. The mile marker was still there, white and clean and new-looking, but no blood, no prints, nothing to show they'd ever existed. Just like the road Morrison had died on, this Highway 284 vanished 3 days later, leaving nothing but wilderness where it had been. That's when I started keeping a log. Every storm that came through, every accident that happened on roads that shouldn't exist, I wrote it down. Times, dates, locations, descriptions of what I found and what disappeared. I kept it in an old composition book, the kind kids use in school, and I locked it in my desk drawer where nobody else would see it. By the summer of '98, I had 17 entries. 17 accidents on impossible roads, involving 23 people. Men, women, children. Locals who'd lived here all their lives and strangers just passing through. The only thing they had in common was bad luck and bad weather. And the blood. Because every one of those phantom roads had them. Mile markers stained with handprints that smelled like fresh blood, no matter how long the accidents had been discovered. Small handprints, always at the same height, always the same dark rust color that made your nose burn and your eyes water. I started carrying a camera in my patrol car, one of those disposable ones you could buy at the drugstore. Every time I got called to one of these accidents, I'd take pictures of everything: the road, the mile markers, the handprints, the crash site. I'd drop the film off at the photo lab in town, and every time the pictures came back the same way, blank. Not overexposed, not underexposed. Just blank, like I'd been taking pictures of nothing at all. That should have been my first clue to leave well enough alone. But I was a lawman, had been for more than 2 decades, and lawmen don't walk away from mysteries. We pick at them like scabs, even when we know it's going to leave a scar. The break came in August, during the worst thunderstorm I'd seen in years. The kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up and turns the air green and electric. I was in my office, working late on some paperwork, when the emergency radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we got a situation out on Highway 52. Looks like a bad one." That was Deputy Collins, my youngest officer and the only one who hadn't yet learned that some things are better left unreported. Highway 52 was real enough. It ran north-south through the county, connecting Millbrook to the state highway system. But when I drove out there, following Collins' directions, I found something that shouldn't have existed. A turn-off. It was just past mile marker 23, marked with one of those green highway signs that said, Highway 847 South, in clean white letters. The road itself looked new, the asphalt dark and smooth, the yellow lines bright as fresh paint. It curved off into the woods, disappearing around a bend about 100 yards from the highway. I'd driven past that spot thousands of times in my career. There'd never been a turnoff there, never been so much as a mailbox or a dirt driveway. Just trees, thick and old and unbroken. But now there was a road. I pulled over and got out of my patrol car, flashlight in hand despite the fact that my headlights were still on. The storm was getting worse, rain coming down in sheets that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Lightning turned the world white every few seconds, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the ground under my feet. That's when I saw the mile marker. It stood at the entrance to the new road, reflecting my flashlight beam like a mirror. Mile marker 1, clean and white and new. But about 3 feet up from the base, there were handprints. Fresh handprints, dark and wet and glistening in the light. I shouldn't be taking that turn. Every mile I drove, the blood got thicker. But I did take it. God help me, I took it, because I was tired of wondering and tired of being afraid of something I couldn't name or understand. I got back in my patrol car, checked that my radio was working, and turned onto Highway 847 South. The road surface was perfect, smooth as glass and quiet as a whisper under my tires. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating the yellow lines that ran straight and true down the center. The trees on either side were thick and close, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the storm. Mile marker 2 appeared in my headlights, then mile marker 3. Each one had the handprints, small and dark and fresh looking. The smell was getting stronger now, seeping through the vents of my air conditioning system despite the fact that my windows were rolled up tight. Sweet and metallic, like blood and rust and something else I couldn't identify. At mile marker 5, I saw the first car. It was a blue Honda, maybe 10 years old, sitting on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The driver's door was open, and I could see someone sitting behind the wheel. I pulled over and got out, my hand instinctively moving to the butt of my service weapon. "Everything all right here?" I called out, approaching the car slowly. The figure behind the wheel turned toward me, and I saw it was a woman, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and eyes that reflected my flashlight like an animal's. She was wearing a white dress that looked like it might have been a wedding dress once, but it was stained now, dark stains that looked black in the beam of my light. "My car broke down," she said, and her voice sounded far away, like she was talking through water. "I've been waiting for help. How long have you been here?" She turned to look at something I couldn't see, and when she looked back, her smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Since 1987. That's when I noticed the smell was coming from her car. Not just blood now, but something rotten, something that had been dead for a long time. I took a step back, my hand tightening on my weapon. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." But when I blinked, she was gone. The car was still there, hazard lights still blinking, driver's door still open. But the seat was empty, and when I played my flashlight over the interior, I could see that the upholstery was rotted away, the metal springs showing through like exposed bones. I got back in my patrol car and kept driving. Mile marker 7 had a pickup truck, a red Ford that looked like it had been burning for hours but never quite caught fire. Smoke poured from under the hood, but the metal wasn't hot when I touched it. It was cold, ice cold, despite the flames that seemed to dance over the engine block. Mile marker 9 had a minivan with Florida plates, the same one I'd seen at the bottom of a ravine the year before. The family was still inside, still dead, but they turned to look at me as I drove past. The children waved from the back seat, their small faces pale and smiling in the red glow of my taillights. At mile marker 12, I stopped the car. The handprints here weren't just on the mile marker. They were everywhere, on the trees, on the road surface, on the hood and windshield of my patrol car. Hundreds of them, thousands, all the same size, all the same dark color that made my throat close up and my eyes water. And I could hear them now. Children's voices, soft and distant, calling from somewhere in the woods. Not words exactly, but sounds. Pleading sounds, like they were lost and scared and looking for someone to help them. The sounds got louder as I sat there, more urgent, until I realized they weren't coming from the woods at all. They were coming from under the road. I got out of the car and knelt down, pressing my ear to the asphalt. It was warm, warmer than it should have been on a night like this, and I could feel a vibration running through it like a pulse. Like a heartbeat. The voices were clearer now, and I could make out words. "Help us," they were saying. "Please help us. We can't get out. We can't get out." That's when I understood. The road wasn't built on the ground. It was built over something. Over them. All those people who died in accidents on roads that shouldn't exist, who'd taken wrong turns in the dark and ended up in places that weren't supposed to be there. They weren't gone. They were underneath, trapped in the space between what was real and what was possible. And every time it stormed, every time the conditions were just right, the road would appear again. Another chance for someone to take that wrong turn, to add their voice to the chorus underneath. I looked up at mile marker 12, at the fresh handprints that covered it like a plague, and I finally understood what they were. Not blood. Not rust. Something else. Something that marked the boundary between the world of the living and the place where the lost ones waited. I should have turned around then. Should have gotten back in my car and driven back to the highway and never spoken of what I'd seen. But I didn't. Because I'm a lawman, and lawmen don't leave people behind. Even people who'd been dead for years. Mile marker 15 was where the road ended. Not in a dead end or a turnaround, but in nothing. The asphalt just stopped, like someone had drawn a line and said, "This far and no farther." Beyond it was darkness so complete that my headlights couldn't penetrate it, couldn't even reflect off of it. It was like looking into the deepest part of a well, the kind of darkness that has weight and substance. And standing at the edge of that darkness, at the very end of the road, was a child. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a yellow raincoat that was too big for her. Her back was to me, and she was perfectly still, like a statue. Like she'd been waiting there for a very long time. I got out of my car and walked toward her, my footsteps echoing on the wet asphalt. The rain had stopped, I realized. The storm was over, but I hadn't noticed when it ended. "Little girl?" I called out. "Are you all right?" She turned around, and I saw her face. I won't describe it to you. I can't. Some things are too big for words, too terrible to put into language that decent people might hear. But I will say this, she had been beautiful once, before whatever happened to her happened. Before she ended up here, at the end of this impossible road, waiting for someone to find her. "Are you the sheriff?" she asked, and her voice was the voice of every child who'd ever been lost or scared or hurt. "Yes," I managed to say. "Yes, I'm the sheriff. I've been waiting for you," she said. "We all have." That's when I saw them. The others. They came out of the darkness like smoke, like shadows, dozens of them. Men, women, children. All the people who died on roads that shouldn't exist, who'd taken wrong turns and ended up in places that weren't on any map. "We can't leave," the little girl said. "Not until someone takes our place." I understood then why the road appeared during storms, why it always disappeared after a few days. It was hunting. Looking for someone to complete the pattern, to close the circle. All those accidents, all those deaths, they weren't random. They were invitations. And I'd accepted mine. The little girl held out her hand, and I saw that it was stained with the same dark substance that covered the mile markers. "Will you help us?" she asked. I looked back at my patrol car, sitting alone on the impossible road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a prayer. I thought about Deputy Collins, probably wondering where I'd gone. I thought about my wife, asleep at home, not knowing that her husband had driven into a place that existed only in the spaces between storms. I thought about all the people who'd died here, who'd been trapped here, who'd been waiting for someone like me to find them. And I made my choice. I took the little girl's hand. Her fingers were cold, colder than winter, colder than death. But as soon as I touched her, I felt something shift. The darkness began to recede, pulling back like a curtain being drawn. The voices under the road grew quieter, then faded away entirely. One by one, the others began to fade as well. The little girl was the last to go, and just before she disappeared entirely, she smiled at me. A real smile, the kind a child gives when someone's kept a promise. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she was gone. I stood alone at the end of the road, holding nothing but empty air and the memory of a touch colder than grave dirt. Behind me, I could hear my patrol car's engine running, the radio crackling with static and distant voices. I walked back to the car and got in, put it in reverse and backed up to mile marker 12, then turned around and headed back toward the highway. The mile markers were clean now, white and unmarked. The cars were gone. The voices were silent. At the highway, I stopped and looked back. Highway 847 South was still there, still paved and marked with that green sign. But even as I watched, it began to fade. The asphalt turned gray, then brown, then green as grass and weeds pushed up through cracks that appeared like spider webs. The sign rusted and fell, and within minutes, there was nothing but forest again. Like it had never been there at all. I drove back to town as the sun was coming up, painting the sky the color of old blood. Stopped at the diner for coffee and breakfast, sat at the counter like I did every morning, and listened to the local news on the radio. Nothing about missing persons, nothing about mysterious roads or impossible accidents. Nothing about a sheriff who'd made a deal with the dead. That was 27 years ago, and I'd never told this story to another living soul. But I'd been thinking about it more lately, especially during storm season. Because I know what I saw out there, and I know what I did. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling and the rain is coming down in sheets, I wonder if I made the right choice. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about making deals with the dead. They don't always stay dead. Last month, during the worst storm we'd had in years, I was driving home from the office when I saw something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. There, just past mile marker 23, on Highway 52, was a green sign I'd hoped never to see again. Highway 847 South. It said in clean white letters. And underneath it, in smaller print that I swear wasn't there before, Sheriff's Road. I didn't take the turn. I kept driving, eyes straight ahead, radio turned up loud to drown out the sound of children's voices calling from the woods. But I know it's still there, waiting for the next storm, the next lost soul who needs to find their way home. I'm getting old now, too old to be carrying a badge much longer. And when I retire, when I hang up my gun and turn in my keys, I wonder who'll be left to watch the roads that shouldn't exist. Who'll be there to make sure that the dead stay dead, and the living stay living. Because the thing about Highway 847 South is this: it's not just a road anymore. It's become a responsibility. And responsibilities, once accepted, are terrible hard things to put down. The blood's getting thicker every storm. And I'm running out of miles to give.